England in the mid-11th century was a prosperous and well-organized kingdom with deep historical roots. For about 150 years, the land had been unified under Anglo-Saxon rule. The first king to truly rule a single English kingdom was King Ethelstan in 927, and since then, the realm had largely remained intact. The population of England was a mixture of ethnic Anglo-Saxons and the descendants of Viking settlers, especially in northern regions. Earlier in the 9th and 10th centuries, Viking invasions had threatened Anglo-Saxon England. The famous King Alfred the Great and his successors managed to halt the first waves of Viking incursions, preserving the Anglo-Saxon realms. By the late 10th century, however, new Viking attacks resumed, ultimately leading to a period of Danish rule. The Danish king Canute and his dynasty ruled England from 1016 until 1042, integrating the kingdom into a North Sea empire. Despite this foreign rule, English institutions and society remained robust and largely undisturbed. When King Canute's line died out, the throne reverted to the Anglo-Saxon royal line under King Edward, later known as Edward the Confessor, in 1042. Edward the Confessor's reign, 1042-1066, restored native English monarchy, and for 24 years, Anglo-Saxons and Danes in England lived relatively peacefully together. During Edward's rule, the machinery of English government, its shires and hundreds, its royal courts and taxation system, continued to function smoothly. Anglo-Saxon England at that time had a well-developed administration and legal system, with shire reeves, sheriffs, enforcing the law in each county. The kingdom's wealth was notable. A sophisticated tax called the geld filled the treasury, and English silver coinage was of high quality and strictly controlled by the crown. This stability at home meant that when Edward died, England was strong institutionally, but it also meant that the stakes for controlling the English throne were very high. A key aspect of the background to 1066 was England's close connection to Normandy, a duchy in northern France. Normandy itself had been born from Viking settlement. In the year 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple allowed a band of Viking raiders led by Rollo to settle in what became Normandy. These Norse settlers, known as the Normans, adapted quickly to French culture. They converted to Christianity, intermarried with the local French population, and adopted the French language. Over generations, the Normans emerged as redoubtable feudal lords, still martial and bold, but culturally distinct from their Viking forebears. By the 11th century, the Duchy of Normandy was a powerful principality in its own right. Its dukes had consolidated territory and influence, expanding westward and ruling with firm control. The ruling duke by the mid-1000s was William of Normandy, who would later be known as William the Conqueror. Ties between England and Normandy grew strong in Edward's time. King Edward the Confessor had a Norman mother. Queen Emma was the sister of Duke Richard II of Normandy, and Edward himself spent many years in exile in Normandy before becoming king. As king, Edward welcomed Norman friends and advisors at his court. He appointed Normans to important positions, especially within the church in England. This meant that by 1066, there was a Norman influence in English politics and society. A number of Norman-born nobles and clergy held lands or offices in England, thanks to Edward's patronage. These close relations led to cultural exchange, but also to Norman expectations. It was said that Edward, who had no children, may have promised or at least hinted that Duke William of Normandy could succeed him. Whether or not such a promise was formally made, William believed he had a rightful claim to the English throne, partly due to this special relationship and possibly an oath sworn to him by Harold Godwinson, Edward's leading English noble, in years past. Edward the Confessor's reign was also marked by the growing power of the Godwin family in England. Godwin, Earl of Wessex, was Edward's most formidable subject, and their relations were sometimes tense. Godwin's son, Harold Godwinson, became Earl of Wessex after Godwin's death, and was effectively the second most powerful man in the kingdom. commanding broad support among English nobles. Harold was Edward's brother-in-law and served as a loyal warlord against threats like Welsh incursions. By the mid-1060s, Harold Godwinson's prominence in England was unmistakable. He was widely respected as a capable leader. This situation set the stage for a succession dispute. King Edward, despite being revered as pious and gentle, failed to produce an heir. When Edward died on 5th January 1066, the question of who would succeed him became urgent and critical. Edward's death without a clear heir unleashed a succession crisis in 1066. The English High Council, known as the Witenagemot, convened and chose Harold Godwinson as the next king, reflecting the native nobility's preference for a strong English ruler. Harold was crowned King of England, King Harold II, shortly after Edward's funeral, with the ceremony taking place, according to English sources, at Westminster Abbey. Harold's accession, however, was immediately challenged by powerful outsiders. Two foreign claimants asserted that they were the rightful heirs to Edward's throne. One was Duke William of Normandy, who claimed that Edward had promised the crown to him and that Harold Godwinson had even sworn an oath of support for William's claim in the past. The other was King Harold Hardrada of Norway, a famed Viking warrior king, who based his claim on an old agreement between prior kings of England and Norway. According to that agreement, between Hardrada's predecessor Magnus and the late King Harthacnut of England, if either died without an heir, the other would inherit both kingdoms. Hardrada believed this pact gave him a legitimate shot at the English crown, once Edward, Harthacnut's half-brother, left no offspring. Thus, by early 1066, 3 strong men laid claim to England. Harold Godwinson stood as the choice of the English nobility and people, a seasoned Anglo-Saxon statesman and general. Across the Channel, Duke William marshalled his Norman barons, convinced that England rightfully belonged to him. And in Scandinavia, King Harold Hardrada, last of the great Viking kings, prepared his longships, lured by the prospect of adding England to his domains. This was the larger context in which the Battle of Hastings would occur, a moment when the ambitions of Anglo-Saxon, Norman, and Norse leaders all converged on English soil. In the sections that follow, we will explore this story slowly and thoroughly. We will remain factual and calm, guiding you through the background of Anglo-Saxon England, the rise of Duke William, the dramatic events of 1066, and the battle itself. Each part of this history will be recounted in a gentle, even tone, painting a detailed but soothing picture of a pivotal moment in history. Before we delve into the battles and marches, let us first take a closer look at the world of the Anglo-Saxons, and then at the Normans under William, to understand the peoples and leaders who would clash in 1066. To fully appreciate the significance of 1066, one must understand the Anglo-Saxon world that existed on the eve of the conquest. The Anglo-Saxons were the inhabitants of England, a people with a rich culture, their own language, and well-established traditions of kingship and law. By the 11th century, Anglo-Saxon England was one of the most developed kingdoms in Europe. It had a structured society, a powerful monarchy tempered by counsel from nobles and churchmen, and an economy that was admired for its efficiency. Politically, the kingdom was divided into large regional earldoms, such as Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, but all owed allegiance to the English crown. A system of local governance was in place. Shire courts and hundred courts dispensed justice, and officials known as reeves or sheriffs managed royal administration in each shire. This provided stability and continuity. In fact, historians note that Anglo-Saxon governmental systems were highly sophisticated, even more so than Normandy's at that time. For example, England had a permanent royal treasury at Winchester and a bureaucracy capable of issuing written royal orders, rights, across the realm. These systems meant that day-to-day life and law did not depend solely on the king's personal presence, a valuable legacy of centuries of English statecraft. Socially, Anglo-Saxon England was hierarchical, but with some mobility. At the top of society was the king, followed by powerful noble families that held earldoms. There was also a class of lesser nobles called thanes, who owned estates and served in local government or the military. Beneath them were ceorls, freemen farmers, who worked their own land or that of a lord, and at the bottom, a class of slaves, though slavery in England was gradually declining in prevalence by the 1060s. The church was a central part of Anglo-Saxon life, with local parishes and great monasteries. Bishops were influential figures often involved in governance. The literacy and learning fostered by the church meant that chronicles were kept. For example, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was a record of yearly events kept in some monasteries, and it provides contemporary insight into 1066 in a sober, understated way. All this contributes to a picture of a society that, while it had its share of feuds and conflicts, valued order and continuity. Economically, the land was fertile and well cultivated. The majority of people lived by farming, and villages of timber-framed houses dotted the countryside. Evenings would have been quiet and dark, lit by hearth fires, with the routines of agricultural life dictating the pace of work and rest. Towns, known as burhs or boroughs, existed as centres of trade, often fortified with earth ramparts from earlier times. Trade flourished, with markets buying and selling wool, cloth, metalwork and produce. Coins minted in English mints circulated widely, evidence of the kingdom's wealth. The quality of Anglo-Saxon coinage was renowned. Coins were regularly re-minted to maintain silver purity, a testament to the kingdom's sophisticated economy. Travellers in the 1050s would have found England studded with churches, most built of wood, some stone, and perhaps noticed the relative peace and prosperity that prevailed under King Edward's gentle rule. One cannot describe the Anglo-Saxon world without mentioning its military structure, since that would soon be tested in 1066. Unlike the Normans, the English did not maintain a large force of cavalry. Instead, their strength lay in infantry, foot soldiers who could be called up through the fyrd, a kind of militia levy. For every 5 hides of land, a hide being roughly the amount needed to support one household, one man was expected to serve in the fyrd if summoned. This system meant the king could raise a considerable army from among the free peasants and gentry, though the fyrd would typically serve only for a limited time, usually 2 months, before men went home to tend their fields. Alongside the fyrd were the professional soldiers known as housecarls, the royal household troops and the retinues of major earls. Housecarls were full-time warriors, often equipped with heavy mail armour and renowned for wielding the 2-handed Danish battle axe with great skill. These men provided a disciplined corps for the army. In battle, the English preferred to fight on foot, forming a shield wall, a solid fence of shields presented by the front ranks to blunt any attack. This tactic had proven effective against Viking raiders and Welsh princes alike. Life in Anglo-Saxon England was in many ways stable and traditional. People knew their place in the social order and followed the seasons in their farming and festivals. They spoke Old English, or Anglo-Saxon tongue, a Germanic language with a rich oral literature of poems and songs. They honoured old heroes like Beowulf in stories told by firesides, and they revered Christian saints in their local churches. The laws of the land, many codified by kings like Alfred, Ethelred and Cnut, protected property and persons, albeit with a system of fines, vergild, in place of more modern concepts of justice. By 1065, there had been peace in most of England for over a decade, broken only by a few skirmishes on the borders. The biggest unrest had come in late 1065, when Harold Godwinson's brother, Tostig, was ousted as Earl of Northumbria due to a rebellion by northern nobles, a crisis that King Edward and Harold had managed to resolve by exiling Tostig. This incident would soon have consequences, as we shall see, but as the year 1066 dawned, England itself was not at war. It is easy to imagine that most ordinary villagers and townsfolk began that year with no inkling that their country was about to be invaded twice and forever changed. In summary, the Anglo-Saxon world before the Battle of Hastings was one of relative tranquility, strong governance, and deeply rooted customs. It was a world about to be disrupted. The English, under Harold Godwinson, would soon find themselves fighting desperately to preserve that way of life. The first challenge came from across the North Sea, and then from across the English Channel. But before we turn to the invaders, let us introduce the main antagonist of our story, Duke William of Normandy and the Norman world he came from, which was in many ways as complex and formidable as Anglo-Saxon England. Across the English Channel from Anglo-Saxon England lay the Duchy of Normandy, a land that in 1066 was energetic, militarized, and ambitious. The Normans, as mentioned, descended from Viking raiders who settled in northern France in the early 10th century. Over approximately 150 years, these settlers and their Frankish neighbours merged into a unique culture. They spoke Norman French, a dialect of Old French, and had adopted feudal customs of lordship and vassalage. A Norman noble of 1066 prided himself on his knightly prowess, horsemanship and skill at arms, and on his loyalty to his lord. The Normans were among the leading exponents of mounted warfare in Europe. While Anglo-Saxon nobles fought on foot, Norman knights fought on horseback with lance and sword, supported by archers and foot soldiers. This difference would prove decisive on the battlefield. At the head of Normandy in 1066 was Duke William II of Normandy, a man of iron will and considerable experience. William was born around 1027 or 1028 in the town of Falaise, the illegitimate son of Duke Robert V of Normandy. His mother Herleva was not married to Robert, earning William the early nickname William the Bastard. Despite this stain of illegitimacy, Duke Robert had recognized William as his heir before leaving on a pilgrimage in 1035. Robert died during that journey, leaving young William, only about 7 or 8 years old, to inherit the duchy. This led to a turbulent childhood for William. Normandy's barons were unruly, and some resented being led by a boy, especially one born out of wedlock. Several guardians and advisors who protected William in his youth were assassinated in the chaotic years that followed. It's said that William grew up fast and learned the arts of survival early. By his teens, he faced open rebellions. One of the fiercest challenges came from a powerful relative, Guy of Burgundy, who contested William's rule. William, with the crucial aid of his feudal overlord King Henry I of France, defeated the rebels at the Battle of Valais-Dunes in 1047. This victory, won when William was about 20, helped establish his control, though it took several more years to fully pacify the duchy. Throughout the 1050s, William dealt with further revolts and external threats. In 1054, King Henry of France himself turned against William, leading an invasion into Norman lands. William managed to beat back this assault, winning battles, such as at Mortimer in 1054, and quashing conspiracies against him. By 1060, fortune favoured William. Both King Henry of France and Count Geoffrey of Anjou, another powerful rival, died that year. Their deaths removed William's chief external enemies. Finally secure at home, William could expand his influence. He had already asserted overlordship over neighbouring regions like Maine. Importantly, William had also forged a strong alliance by marriage. Around 1050, he married Matilda of Flanders, daughter of the Count of Flanders. This union brought William prestige and a valuable ally on Normandy's northeastern border. Matilda bore William several children, including 4 sons, securing the Norman ducal lineage. By the mid-1060s, William had matured into a formidable ruler, tough, shrewd, and with a decade and a half of ducal governance under his belt. The Normandy that William ruled was one of the powerhouse regions of France. Norman knights and nobles were notorious for their martial vigour. They had been fighting not only in Normandy, but across Europe. Normans served as mercenaries or adventurers as far away as southern Italy, where in these same years, other Norman knights were conquering lands from the Byzantines and Saracens. At home, Normandy was wealthy and well populated. It benefited from fertile farmland and thriving towns like Rouen, the ducal capital, and Caen, where William built a great castle and would later build abbeys. Norman monasteries were centres of learning. Indeed, a Norman monk would later write one of the key accounts of the conquest. But it was the military reputation of Normandy that stood tallest. The Norman nobility were experts in castle building and siegecraft. Normandy was dotted with castles, mostly wooden Motte and Bailey fortifications, which had helped William suppress revolts. These lords were experienced in cavalry warfare, often clad in chainmail hauberks and conical helmets, carrying kite-shaped shields and lances. Such men were eager for land and glory, and William was not one to hold them back. William's claim to the English throne stemmed from his familial and political ties with King Edward. Edward the Confessor, having grown up in Normandy, was William's distant cousin. Edward's mother, Emma, was the sister of William's grandfather. It was said that Edward had once promised William the succession, possibly in the year 1051, when Edward was at odds with the Godwin family and William visited England. Another significant event was that Harold Godwinson himself had been shipwrecked on the Norman coast in 1064 and became William's involuntary guest for a time. Norman chroniclers later insisted that during this visit, Harold swore a sacred oath to support William's right to the English throne. The Bayeux Tapestry, a famous embroidered cloth made shortly after the conquest, even depicts Harold with his hand on holy relics, swearing an oath. Presumably, this is meant to be that very pledge to Duke William. Harold later denied or ignored any such oath, but William remembered. To William, Harold's acceptance of the crown in January 1066 was a direct betrayal of a vow and a usurpation of what William saw as his own rightful inheritance. When the news arrived in Normandy that King Edward had died and Harold Godwinson was crowned king, William's course of action was set. The Duke began preparing to invade England to enforce his claim. However, launching an invasion across the sea was no small task. William spent much of 1066 carefully assembling an army and a fleet. He secured the support of his vassals and also attracted volunteer fighters from beyond Normandy, from Brittany, Flanders, France, and elsewhere, lured by the promise of land and reward in England. All that spring and summer, ships were being built or gathered in Norman ports. It's reported that William amassed a fleet of several hundred ships by late summer. Contemporary Norman sources gave wildly inflated numbers for William's army and fleet. Some claimed 14,000 or even more than 50,000 men. But modern historians estimate William's invasion force might have been in the range of 7,000 to 12,000 men, including perhaps 2,000, 3,000 knights on horseback. Crucially, Duke William obtained a moral banner for his enterprise. According to Norman accounts, Pope Alexander II gave his blessing to William's invasion and sent him a papal banner to carry into battle. This papal support, the veracity of which some historians debate, bolstered William's position by framing his bid for the English throne as a righteous cause, even a holy war against perjury and usurpation. By late summer 1066, William's plans were nearly ready, but nature did not immediately cooperate. All of August and into September, the winds over the Channel blew from the wrong direction, pinning William's fleet in port. While the Normans waited impatiently at the coast near the mouth of the River Somme, events in England took a dramatic turn, something William might have seen as divine providence. In late September, as we shall detail soon, King Harold of England had to rush north to defeat an invading Norwegian army led by Harold Hardrada. Only after Harold had won that victory did the winds change in William's favour. Seizing the moment, William set sail for England in late September. His fleet crossed the Channel and landed at Pevensey on the Sussex coast on 28 September 1066, catching the locals by surprise. The Normans quickly moved to secure a beachhead. They built a temporary wooden castle at Hastings and began raiding the surrounding area for supplies. The long-anticipated Norman invasion was underway. It is worth noting the character of Duke William as he embarked on this momentous campaign. William was about 38 years old, in the prime of life for a medieval leader. He was hardened by combat and administration, a stern man known for his energy and resolve. Chroniclers, even those hostile to him, acknowledged William's intelligence and determination. He could be ruthless. He had put down rebellions mercilessly in Normandy, but he was also savvy and charismatic enough to bind men to his cause. In 1066, William carried not only his personal ambition, but also the aspirations of his Norman followers, who saw England as a land of great reward. The risks were high. Crossing the sea into hostile territory was perilous, and failure would mean ruin. Yet William showed no hesitation. As the ships set sail, one chronicler says William's flagship carried the papal banner at its masthead, and on its sails was painted a blazing comet. Indeed, Halley's comet had appeared in the skies in April 1066, a bright omen that many in Europe took as a sign of a coming great change. The Bayeux Tapestry famously depicts Halley's comet and labels it as a wondrous sign that left the English in awe and fear. One might imagine Duke William saw it as a herald of his impending fortune. Seen from the Bayeux Tapestry, showing people marveling at Halley's comet in 1066. The appearance of this comet in April 1066 was interpreted by many as an omen of momentous events, coming just after King Harold's coronation. Thus, by early October 1066, two invasions of England were in motion, one from Norway in the north and one from Normandy in the south. Harold Godwinson, the embattled English king, would have to confront both nearly back to back. In the next sections, we will slowly recount the dramatic unfolding of those invasions. First, we will turn to the events just before Hastings, the prelude to the battle, including Harold's swift response to the Norwegian threat, and how William established himself on English soil. Then we will describe the Battle of Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire, a fierce clash that is often overshadowed by Hastings, but is crucial to our story. After that, we will follow Harold's arduous march south to face William. All of this will be told in a calm and measured manner, allowing the details to settle gently in the mind. The year 1066 in England was marked by a rapid chain of events that led King Harold II up and down the length of his kingdom. After Harold's coronation in January, there was a brief period of uneasy peace. Harold Godwinson knew that challenges were likely to come from abroad, so he began making preparations. Throughout the spring and summer of 1066, King Harold kept the southern coast of England on alert, expecting Duke William of Normandy might attempt an invasion. Harold gathered forces and even assembled a fleet to patrol the Channel. Month after month passed, with Harold's levies, farmers turned soldiers, waiting on the Sussex and Kentish shores. However, maintaining an army in the field was costly and difficult, especially during harvest season. Come early September, with supplies low and many of his men anxious to return home to gather crops, Harold reluctantly dismissed the Southern Third and Navy on September 8th. Many of those soldiers went back to their farms, likely relieved, but still wary. Fatefully, this demobilization occurred just as the greatest threat of the moment was about to strike. Not from Normandy in the south, but from Norway in the north. Harold's estranged brother, Tostig Godwinson, had a key role in what came next. Tostig had been the Earl of Northumbria until late 1065, when the Northumbrians revolted against his rule, accusing him of misgovernment and harshness, and Harold supported the rebels' choice to replace Tostig. Feeling betrayed, Tostig left England, nursing a bitter grudge against his brother Harold. Early in 1066, Tostig attempted some raids on the English coast to test Harold's strength. In the spring, he landed on the Isle of Wight, and then in Lincolnshire with a small fleet, hoping locals would rally to him. But he found little support. King Harold's navy chased Tostig off, and Tostig fled to Scotland to bide his time and seek allies. The ally he found was formidable, King Harold Hardrada of Norway. Hardrada was renowned as one of the toughest warriors of the age. A towering figure, literally. Legend describes him as exceptionally tall, and figuratively, with a long career of battles across Europe. Hearing of Edward's death, Hardrada agreed with Tostig to press his claim on England. It was a classic Viking enterprise, sail to England with a host of warriors and seize the crown by sword. In September 1066, Hardrada set sail from Norway with what sources say was a massive fleet, perhaps 300 longships, carrying an army that could have been 10,000 to 15,000 strong. This may well be an exaggeration, but clearly it was a very large force for the time. The Norwegian fleet traversed the North Sea and landed on the northeast English coast, near the River Tyne, then moved down towards the Humber estuary. Tostig joined Hardrada's host with his own followers. The invaders struck inland toward the city of York, the chief city of the north. The first pitched battle of the invasion occurred on 20 September 1066 at the Battle of Fulford, just outside York. There, Earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, Harold's young brothers-in-law, who led the northern earldoms, hurriedly assembled an army to defend York. A fierce fight ensued by the banks of the Ouse River. Hardrada's seasoned Norwegian warriors, likely deploying their own wall of shields and long axes, crushed the English northern earls' forces. Edwin and Morcar's army was defeated decisively at Fulford. York, facing this disaster, surrendered to Hardrada shortly thereafter. The Norwegian king took hostages from the city and demanded provisions. He agreed to withdraw to a spot east of York at Stamford Bridge to await further tribute and the formal capitulation of Northumbria. King Harold Godwinson was in his capital, London, when he learned of the Norwegian invasion. The news must have been alarming. A huge enemy force in the north, and his northern earls defeated. Harold acted with remarkable swiftness. He gathered his household troops and whatever further forces he could muster on short notice and marched north at breakneck speed. Contemporary accounts suggest that Harold's army covered the distance from London to York, about 185 miles, in as little as 4 to 7 days, an astonishing pace. Day after day, Harold pushed his men hard, and they arrived in Yorkshire earlier than anyone expected. The Norwegians certainly did not expect Harold to come so soon. On 25 September 1066, just 5 days after Fulford, Harold Godwinson's army reached York and then advanced to Stamford Bridge, catching King Hardrada and Tostig completely by surprise. We will detail the Battle of Stamford Bridge in the next section, but suffice it to say here that Harold achieved a great victory there on 25 September. Harold Hardrada and Tostig were both slain, and the Norwegian army was devastated so badly that only a couple dozen ships out of their entire fleet were needed to carry the survivors back home. It was a triumph for King Harold. He had removed one rival claimant and saved his kingdom's north from conquest. Yet this triumph came at a heavy cost. Harold's forces had suffered significant casualties in the battle, and those who survived were exhausted and far from home. Moreover, even as Harold celebrated his northern victory, word was about to reach him of another dire threat. Duke William had finally crossed the Channel and landed in Sussex on the southern coast. The prelude to Hastings thus involves Harold being in the worst possible position strategically. On 1st October, Harold was still in York, enjoying a short-lived rest and the accolades of the citizens for saving them. In the days immediately after Stamford Bridge, Harold received news that Duke William's fleet had landed on 28 September. The Normans were fortifying a base at Hastings and ravaging the surrounding countryside, burning houses and farms, hoping to draw Harold southward by terrorizing his people. Upon hearing this, Harold faced an agonizing decision. He could wait in London, gather fresh troops, for many of the southern third had gone home and needed resummoning, and perhaps force William to come to him. Or he could march quickly to confront William before the Normans entrenched themselves further. Harold chose to move immediately, perhaps counting on speed and surprise as he had in the north. He and his hardcore of housecarl veterans, still battle-weary, began the journey back down to the south coast. They covered the nearly 200 miles to London in about a week. Along the way, Harold called upon the levies of shires to join him. Many answered, though given the short notice and fatigue of previous service, Harold's southern army at Hastings probably did not include all who had been on alert in the summer. Nevertheless, by the second week of October, Harold had assembled a substantial force in and around London, ready to face the Norman invaders. During this time, attempts at diplomacy or negotiation were minimal. There are some accounts that Duke William sent envoys to Harold, or vice versa, once William landed, each claiming the crown and perhaps seeking a bloodless submission. These likely went nowhere. Both leaders were determined and saw the other as a usurper. William stayed near his landing spot, not venturing far from his ships. He established a wooden castle at Hastings, secure as a fallback position. His men carried out foraging expeditions, which sometimes devolved into outright pillage, harassing the local English population. This strategy was partly meant to pressure King Harold. The longer Harold delayed, the more his people in Sussex would suffer Norman depredations. Harold, for his part, may have wished to catch William off guard, as he had Hardrada. He likely hoped to replicate the success of Stamford Bridge by striking quickly. By around 12th October, King Harold had arrived in the vicinity of Hastings with his army. He positioned himself on high ground along a ridge known in later tradition as Senlac Hill, near a small forest and not far from the road from London. His choice of ground was strong defensively, a slope that would force the Normans to charge uphill. Harold's forces, composed entirely of infantry, took up their positions, arranging themselves in a shield wall formation along the crest of the ridge. There they waited for William's approach. The Normans, being informed by scouts of Harold's arrival, marched out from their camp at Hastings to meet the English about 7 miles to the northwest. On the morning of 14th October 1066, the two armies came into view of each other near the site of the present-day town of Battle in East Sussex. It is said the weather that day was fair. The sun rose bright and clear, typical of an English autumn. As both sides prepared for the confrontation, one can imagine a brief stillness before the storm of battle. Harold's men, perhaps 7,000, 8,000 strong, stood shoulder to shoulder on the ridge, Huscarls in the front ranks with their mail armour and great axes, the ferdmen behind with spears and farm tools turned weapons. They likely felt a grim determination. These were their home fields they stood upon, and behind them lay the road to London and the heart of their country. Facing them across the field was Duke William's host of Normans and allies, comparable in size. The Normans arranged themselves in ranks as well, but of a different composition. Archers in front, foot soldiers behind them, and at the rear, the mounted knights divided into contingents from Normandy, Brittany, and France. Duke William himself, armoured and on horseback, rode among his troops to encourage them. The stage was set for one of the most consequential battles in medieval history. This calm recounting of the prelude shows how swiftly fortune shifted in 1066. Harold had barely tasted victory in the north when he was compelled to race south for another, even greater trial. The men on both sides that October morning were likely tired from marches and previous fights, yet resolved to do their duty. In the next section, we will describe the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold's northern victory, in a bit more detail, before turning to the confrontation at Hastings. Though not directly part of the Hastings battle, Stamford Bridge greatly affected it by weakening Harold's army. We will narrate Stamford Bridge with the same level tone, as it too was a fierce contest, albeit won by Harold. Then we shall proceed to the march south, and finally to the Battle of Hastings itself. On 25 September 1066, less than 3 weeks before the Battle of Hastings, King Harold II of England faced the forces of King Harold Hardrada of Norway at Stamford Bridge, a crossing over the River Derwent east of York. The clash at Stamford Bridge is often considered the final act of the Viking Age, and it was a brutal battle with high casualties on both sides. We will recount it here in a subdued and factual manner, as a precursor to the events at Hastings. After the Norwegian victory at Fulford and the fall of York, Harold Hardrada might have believed the hardest work was done. The Norsemen had negotiated the surrender of the city and were waiting to receive tribute and hostages from the English. On the morning of 25 September, a portion of Hardrada's army was at Stamford Bridge in a fairly relaxed posture. Many of the Norse had even left their mail armour back at their ships at Rickhall some miles away, expecting no immediate combat. It was a warm, late summer day, and reportedly the Vikings were caught off guard, possibly sunning themselves or resting. Suddenly, to their astonishment, a large English army appeared approaching the bridge from the west. Harold Godwinson had executed an almost unbelievable forced march, and now was upon them far sooner than they could have anticipated. The initial encounter unfolded at the narrow wooden bridge over the Derwent. The English had to cross this bridge to reach the bulk of the Norwegian army on the opposite bank. Here, legend and chroniclers describe a famous incident. A giant Norse axeman, armed with a massive two-handed Danish axe, planted himself on the bridge and single-handedly held up the English advance. As Harold's men tried to push across in a narrow file, this Viking champion swung his blade with deadly effect, cutting down one English warrior after another. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later sources credit him with slaying perhaps 40 Englishmen in his berserk stand. The scene must have been terrifying, yet grimly impressive to those watching. A lone figure in a horned helmet, so the romantic images often depict, though the actual Viking likely had a standard helmet, cleaving all who approached. How to dislodge such a man? According to the accounts, an English soldier finally came up with a cunning solution. He floated under the bridge in a half-barrel or boat, and then thrust his spear upward through the planks, mortally wounding the axeman from below. With the bridge now clear, Harold's forces surged across. On the east side of the river, Hardrada hurriedly formed his troops into a line, though he had far fewer men immediately at hand than the English. A large portion of his army, some say up to a third or half, had been left behind guarding the ships at Rickhall and were not present at the start of the battle. Seeing the English advance, Hardrada's men probably formed a circle or line with shields, essentially creating their own shield wall. King Harold Hardrada, despite being surprised, was thrilled by the prospect of battle. The sagas say he went into a state of berserkergang, a battle frenzy, casting aside fear. The battle that followed was intense and lengthy. Hardrada himself fought at the front, a towering figure with a broad two-handed sword. At some point early in the battle, the mighty Hardrada was felled. An arrow struck him in the throat, killing him outright. This sudden loss of the Norwegian leader might have decided a lesser fight, but the Norse continued to resist fiercely under new leadership, Tostig and others. When Harold Godwinson offered Tostig peace and his earldom back if he switched sides, Tostig refused, and the battle raged on. As the hours passed, English numbers and persistence gradually overwhelmed the Norwegian force. There was brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Norse, though hard fighters, were by now badly outnumbered. The part of their army that had been guarding the ships eventually arrived, but by then it was too late. They were exhausted from a forced march and joined the fray only to see it mostly lost. By late afternoon, the Norwegian army collapsed. Tostig Godwinson was killed, fighting alongside his Scandinavian allies against his own countrymen. The exact details of his end are not clear, but one can imagine Harold finding his brother's body on the field afterwards, a sorrowful moment in the aftermath of victory. Of the Norwegian host, it said that only 24 ships' worth of men sailed back to Norway, out of the 300 that had come, implying thousands of Vikings were slain. This figure, while from later chroniclers, emphasizes the completeness of the English victory. So blood-soaked was the field that it left a lasting impression. Some accounts claim that for years no grass grew where the fallen had lain, though such claims are common in battle lore. Harold allowed the Norwegian survivors, including Hardrada's son Olaf, to depart in peace after they swore never to attack England again. In this way, Stamford Bridge ended the Viking threat to England for good. Indeed, historians often mark this battle as the terminus of the Viking Age. It was, however, a Pyrrhic victory for Harold. The English had suffered considerable casualties, some estimate around 5,000 English dead, and even more on the Norwegian side. Many of Harold's best housecarls perished or were wounded in the desperate fighting. Furthermore, Harold had expended his energy and that of his army in this northern campaign. There would be no time for rest. Barely days later, news came of William's landing in Sussex. Harold had to summon whatever strength remained to march his troops roughly 250 miles back south. One can imagine the fatigue and perhaps frustration of the English soldiers. They had marched to York at breakneck speed, won a costly battle, and now had to march all the way back to face a new enemy. Before leaving York, Harold visited the Church of St. Peter, York Minster, to give thanks for victory. He likely tended to the wounded as best as circumstances allowed and arranged burials for the dead. Local tradition says that the bodies of Hardrada and Tostig were given proper attention. Hardrada's body was eventually returned to Norway for burial, while Tostig's was buried in York. King Harold's behaviour was by accounts honourable and pious in victory. He did not punish the city of York for having surrendered to the Norwegians, recognising that they had had little choice. After only a brief stay in York, probably not more than a week, Harold gathered what forces he could, including some reinforcements that had come from the south too late for Stamford Bridge, and began the march back. Some of the troops who had fought at Stamford Bridge may have been left behind due to wounds or sheer exhaustion. Others accompanied Harold loyally, though doubtless their feet were sore and their numbers thinned. Meanwhile, William's Norman forces were establishing their foothold. On 1st October or thereabouts, King Harold set out from York to return to London. The journey took roughly 2 weeks. He arrived in the London area by around 12 October, where he paused briefly to assemble the southern levies that had not yet seen action, including forces from the Midlands and the south that had sat out the northern campaign. The contrast between the two kings at this juncture is striking. Harold was now a victor of one major battle and a long march, but his army was battered. William had not yet fought a battle in England and had given his troops a short period to fortify and rest since landing. William's men, however, were in a foreign land, living off the land and perhaps somewhat uneasy about facing the reputedly fierce English. Harold's men, though tired, were fighting for their homeland. Both leaders exuded confidence outwardly. Neither could know for certain who would prevail, but both must have believed strongly in their cause. Harold likely felt that God had granted him one victory and might grant another. William felt that God had led him across the sea and given him a chance to claim what was his. Stamford Bridge thus set the stage for Hastings by removing one contender and by weakening Harold's strength for the confrontation with William. In a calmer sense, it also offers a poignant moment in history, the final clash of a Viking host with Anglo-Saxons, with the Anglo-Saxons winning. Had the year ended there, Harold would be remembered as a great king who defended England from foreign invasion. But fate had one more challenge for him, waiting on the fields of Sussex. Now, with Stamford Bridge covered, we proceed to the march to Hastings and the dispositions before the battle. We have already touched on Harold's rush south and William's interim actions, but we will go over them again in a smooth narrative to connect to the morning of the Battle of Hastings. Again, we will maintain a tone that is factual and undramatic, simply laying out the movements and decisions calmly. By doing so, we let the facts themselves form the foundation of this dramatic story, without the need for embellishment. King Harold's march from London to the Hastings area in October 1066 was the final leg of his exhausting campaign. After Stamford Bridge, as we discussed, Harold rode south with haste. He likely had with him his corps of housecarls and whatever third levies from the north could still fight. As he moved through the Midlands and southeast England, he summoned additional forces. The English system of raising the third meant messages, perhaps writs or word of mouth via riders, would call local shire levies to assemble. Many of those who had been part of Harold's southern army earlier in the summer answered the call again now that the Normans were actually here on English soil. In London, Harold spent a few days, some sources say about a week at most, gathering troops and preparing. It was in London that two of Harold's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, joined him. These younger Godwinson brothers were also experienced warriors. They had likely been with Harold at Stamford Bridge as well. A legend later asserted that Gurth advised Harold not to engage William in person, suggesting that Harold should stay in London and let the enemy come to him. or at least delay until more forces swelled the ranks. According to this story, Gurth offered to lead an initial resistance himself so that Harold, who had sworn an oath in Normandy, and thus Gurth argued was under a religious cloud, would not risk his life and kingship. Harold supposedly refused this counsel, determined to meet William immediately and decisively, perhaps out of pride or a sense of kingly duty. Whether this counsel happened is uncertain. It appears in some later chronicle accounts, but it captures the precarious situation. Harold likely knew William's forces would only entrench further if given time, and he might have feared that delay could invite desertions among his own levies or additional Normans reinforcing William. So the decision was made: march out from London at once toward the enemy near Hastings. Harold's army moved from London in the second week of October, making its way to Sussex. The exact route is not recorded, but they probably took the old Roman road via Rochester, or perhaps went through Kent, and then westwards. They approached William's position stealthily. Some accounts suggest Harold hoped to catch the Normans unawares, as he had the Norwegians. If so, this element of surprise was lost. William had scouts out and was informed of Harold's approach. It is possible that Harold arrived in the area on the evening of 13th October. Both armies may have camped within a few miles of each other that night, knowing battle would be joined the next day. One imagines a chilly autumn night with a waxing moon, the soldiers perhaps sleeping fitfully on the ground. The Norman camp might have heard distant English shouts or horns, and likewise the English might have seen the glow of Norman campfires over the hills. Early on 14th of October 1066, a Saturday, both forces prepared themselves. Harold's banner, embroidered with a fighting man, called the Fighting Man Standard, was unfurled. William's banner, supposedly the papal banner, and William's own Norman flag with cross, was carried by his standard bearer. The site, as noted, was near the ridge later named Senlac. The English took the high ground. This ridge was essentially Harold's line of defence. To his back, north of his position, were woods and a slight slope downward, which protected his rear. To his flanks were perhaps some marshy lowlands or rough terrain that made it hard for William to outflank him. In front of Harold stretched a gentle slope down toward where William's forces would approach. The name Senlac itself, which emerged in later years, was said to mean sandy stream or sand lake in Old English, referring to a small stream in the valley. That stream may have separated the two armies initially. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply called it the Battle at the Hoary Apple Tree, suggesting perhaps an old distinctive tree was nearby. Much later, after the Normans' victory, they referred to it as the Battle of Hastings, even though Hastings was a few miles away, or sometimes as the Battle of Senlac. In any case, the location has been firmly identified by history and archaeology, and today, Battle Abbey, which we will talk about later, marks the spot. Now, as both armies faced each other, let us set the scene. The English army stood in a dense formation on the ridge. Harold positioned himself at the centre, alongside his housecarls and his personal standard. The housecarls likely formed the front ranks, armoured men with kite shields, and many with the feared Danish axes, a two-handed axe that could cleave helmeted heads or cut down charging horses with enough force. Intermixed or just behind were the furdmen, less armoured, some wearing simple helmets or leather and carrying spears, javelins, or farming implements repurposed as weapons. Few English archers were present. By most accounts, Harold had very limited archers, perhaps because the archers had been in the southern fyrd that was dismissed, or simply because English warfare hadn't emphasised bows heavily. The English line likely stretched wide across the hilltop, maybe about 700 feet or more, trying to prevent the Normans from circling around. They stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping to create a wall. This shield wall was the crux of Harold's strategy, a solid, immovable defence that could blunt Norman attacks. It relied on discipline. Each man had to hold his position and not break rank. Opposite them, the Norman army arranged for an attack. William organised his forces into 3 divisions, often termed battles in medieval parlance. On William's left flank stood the troops from Brittany, a region in France with its own Celtic heritage, under a leader named Alan the Red. These Bretons had some infantry and cavalry. In the centre were William's Norman troops, with many of his close companions and knights from his own duchy around him. On the right were soldiers from France, Flanders, and Picardy, including those led by Count Eustace of Boulogne and William's close friend, William Fitzosborne. Each of these three contingents lined up with archers in front, foot soldiers, infantry, behind the archers, and the knights, cavalry, in the rear as a reserve. The archers were armed with short bows and possibly some crossbows or slings among them. The Norman foot soldiers carried spears and swords and wore mail, not too different from the English housecarls in equipment. The knights on horseback wore conical, helmets with nose guards and long mail hauberks, carrying lances for thrusting and swords for close combat. Many horses were caparisoned with fabric or leather, but not armoured as later medieval knights would be. Still, a charging horseman was a formidable force. Duke William, wearing his distinctive helmet and a hauberk, which supposedly he had trouble putting on that morning until it was the right way around. A small incident turned into a positive omen by saying if it was initially reversed, it meant his fortunes would reverse from duke to king, mounted a Spanish-bred warhorse. William positioned himself initially with the Norman centre. He had at his side his half-brother Bishop Odo of Bayeux, wielding a club, since as a cleric he wasn't to shed blood directly, and other kinsmen like Robert of Mortain. A papal banner given by the Pope was carried to inspire the troops, a sign that they fought with the Church's approval, at least in Norman eyes. With both armies ready, sometime around 9 in the morning, the battle commenced. We will now transition to describing the Battle of Hastings itself in detail, the ebb and flow of combat through the day, the tactics used, and how fate turned. The morning light cast long shadows as Norman archers stepped forward, and English housecarls gripped their axes more tightly. Let us proceed to the narrative of the battle, keeping our tone steady and our descriptions clear as we move through the phases of that long and fateful day. King Harold's march from London to the Hastings area in October 1066 was the final leg of his exhausting campaign. After Stamford Bridge, as we discussed, Harold rode south with haste. He likely had with him his corps of housecarls and whatever third levies from the north could still fight. As he moved through the Midlands and southeast England, he summoned additional forces. The English system of raising the fard meant messages, perhaps writs or word of mouth via riders, would call local shire levies to assemble. Many of those who had been part of Harold's southern army earlier in the summer answered the call again, now that the Normans were actually here on English soil. In London, Harold spent a few days, some sources say about a week at most, gathering troops and preparing. It was in London that two of Harold's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, joined him. These younger Godwinson brothers were also experienced warriors. They had likely been with Harold at Stamford Bridge as well. A legend later asserted that Gurth advised Harold not to engage William in person, suggesting that Harold should stay in London and let the enemy come to him, or at least delay until more forces swelled the ranks. According to this story, Gurth offered to lead an initial resistance himself, so that Harold, who had sworn an oath in Normandy, and thus, Gurth argued, was under a religious cloud, would not risk his life and kingship. Harold supposedly refused this counsel, determined to meet William immediately and decisively, perhaps out of pride or a sense of kingly duty. Whether this counsel happened is uncertain. It appears in some later chronicle accounts, but it captures the precarious situation. Harold likely knew William's forces would only entrench further if given time, and he might have feared that delay could invite desertions among his own levies or additional Normans reinforcing William. So the decision was made. March out from London at once toward the enemy near Hastings. Harold's army moved from London in the second week of October, making its way to Sussex. The exact route is not recorded, but they probably took the old Roman road via Rochester, or perhaps went through Kent, and then westwards. They approached William's position stealthily. Some accounts suggest Harold hoped to catch the Normans unawares, as he had the Norwegians. If so, this element of surprise was lost. William had scouts out, and was informed of Harold's approach. It is possible that Harold arrived in the area on the evening of 13th of October. Both armies may have camped within a few miles of each other that night, knowing battle would be joined the next day. One imagines a chilly autumn night with a waxing moon, the soldiers perhaps sleeping fitfully on the ground. The Norman camp might have heard distant English shouts or horns, and likewise the English might have seen the glow of Norman campfires over the hills. Early on 14th October 1066, a Saturday, both forces prepared themselves. Harold's banner, embroidered with a fighting man, called the Fighting Man Standard, was unfurled. William's banner, supposedly the papal banner, and William's own Norman flag with cross, was carried by his standard bearer. The site, as noted, was near the ridge later named Senlac. The English took the high ground. This ridge was essentially Harold's line of defence. To his back, north of his position, were woods and a slight slope downward which protected his rear. To his flanks were perhaps some marshy lowlands or rough terrain that made it hard for William to outflank him. In front of Harold stretched a gentle slope, down toward where William's forces would approach. The name Senlac itself, which emerged in later years, was said to mean sandy stream, or sand lake in Old English, referring to a small stream in the valley. That stream may have separated the two armies initially. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply called it the Battle at the Hoary Apple Tree, suggesting perhaps an old distinctive tree was nearby. Much later, after the Normans' victory, they referred to it as the Battle of Hastings, even though Hastings was a few miles away, or sometimes as the Battle of Senlac. In any case, the location has been firmly identified by history and archaeology, and today Battle Abbey, which we will talk about later, marks the spot. Now, as both armies faced each other, let us set the scene. The English army stood in a dense formation on the ridge. Harold positioned himself at the centre, alongside his housecarls and his personal standard. The housecarls likely formed the front ranks, armoured men with kite shields and many with the feared Danish axes, a two-handed axe that could cleave helmeted heads or cut down charging horses with enough force. Intermixed or just behind were the third men, less armoured, some wearing simple helmets or leather and carrying spears, javelins, or farming implements repurposed as weapons. Few English archers were present. By most accounts, Harold had very limited archers, perhaps because the archers had been in the southern third that was dismissed, or simply because English warfare hadn't emphasized bows heavily. The English line likely stretched wide across the hilltop, maybe about 700 feet or more, trying to prevent the Normans from circling around. They stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping to create a wall. This shield wall was the crux of Harold's strategy, a solid, immovable defence that could blunt Norman attacks. It relied on discipline. Each man had to hold his position and not break rank. Opposite them, the Norman army arranged for an attack. William organised his forces into 3 divisions, often termed battles in medieval parlance. On William's left flank stood the troops from Brittany, a region in France with its own Celtic heritage, under a leader named Alan the Red. These Bretons had some infantry and cavalry. In the centre were William's Norman troops, with many of his close companions and knights from his own duchy around him. On the right were soldiers from France, Flanders and Picardy, including those led by Count Eustace of Boulogne and William's close friend, William Fitzosborne. Each of these 3 contingents lined up with archers in front, foot soldiers, infantry, behind the archers, and the knights, cavalry, in the rear as a reserve. The archers were armed with short bows, and possibly some crossbows or slings among them. The Norman foot soldiers carried spears and swords, and wore mail, not too different from the English housecarls in equipment. The knights on horseback wore conical helmets with nose guards and long mail hauberks, carrying lances for thrusting and swords for close combat. Many horses were caparisoned with fabric or leather, but not armoured as later medieval knights would be. Still, a charging horseman was a formidable force. Duke William, wearing his distinctive helmet and a hauberk, which supposedly he had trouble putting on that morning until it was the right way around, A small incident turned into a positive omen by saying if it was initially reversed, it meant his fortunes would reverse from duke to king, mounted a Spanish-bred war horse. William positioned himself initially with the Norman centre. He had at his side his half-brother Bishop Odo of Bayeux, wielding a club, since as a cleric he wasn't to shed blood directly, and other kinsmen like Robert of Mortain. A papal banner given by the Pope was carried to inspire the troops, a sign that they fought with the Church's approval, at least in Norman eyes. With both armies ready, sometime around 9 in the morning, the battle commenced. We will now transition to describing the Battle of Hastings itself in detail. The ebb and flow of combat through the day, the tactics used, and how fate turned. The morning light cast long shadows as Norman archers stepped forward and English housecarls gripped their axes more tightly. Let us proceed to the narrative of the battle, keeping our tone steady and our descriptions clear as we move through the phases of that long and fateful day. The Battle of Hastings began at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning on 14th October 1066. It would rage for most of the day until dusk. This battle was a grueling test of endurance and tactics, with moments of high drama which we will relate in a calm, measured way. The opening phase was initiated by Duke William. He intended to soften the English shield wall with archery. Norman archers advanced and loosed volleys of arrows up the slope at Harold's men. However, due to the English position on higher ground and their tight shield formation, these early arrows had limited effect. Many arrows simply struck English shields or flew overhead into the empty ground beyond. The English, having very few archers of their own, did not return equivalent fire, meaning the Normans could not replenish spent arrows from fallen enemy arrows, a small but telling detail noted by chroniclers. After some time of archery yielding little result, William ordered his infantry to attack. Norman foot soldiers, likely shouting war cries in French or Latin, Dexai, God help us, as some sources indicate was William's battle cry, climbed the slope and clashed into the English front line. They were met with a hail of missiles. The English had slingers and javelin throwers among the rear ranks, who now pitched stones and spears over the heads of their front line down onto the advancing Normans. When the Norman infantry reached the shield wall, a brutal close-quarters fight ensued. English housecarls swung their two-handed battle axes with deadly effect, while others stabbed out with spears between shields. The air would have been filled with the crash of iron on wood and the cries of men. The attacking infantry struggled to break through. The English line, dense and resolute, held firm. Whenever a Norman soldier tried to hew at a shield or pry one aside, an English axe or sword cut him down. Contemporary accounts describe how the hillside became littered with Norman dead in this initial assault. Seeing his foot soldiers recoiling, Duke William then committed his cavalry to support them. Norman knights on horseback spurred up the hill, aiming to punch through the weakened points. But charging uphill into a wall of stout Englishmen proved terribly difficult. Horses balked at the steep grade, and those that reached the line reared against the wall of shields, often getting stabbed or struck by axes. The tapestry famously shows one horse's head being chopped by a housecarl's axe. Indeed, many Norman knights likely lost their mounts to English axe blows. The cavalry, too, failed to break the Saxon defence. Before long, William's initial attack was spent, and it began to fall back in disorder. At this critical juncture, panic and rumour nearly decided the battle. On the Norman left flank, the Breton contingent began to give way, perhaps unnerved by the fierce resistance or thinking the battle lost. As they fell back, part of the Norman centre did so as well. A cry went up among the retreating soldiers that Duke William had been killed. News, or rather rumour, of William's death spread fear through the Norman ranks. Men started to flee in earnest, downhill and away. Seeing the enemy in retreat, groups of English ferdmen from the levies, eager for a chase or sensing victory, broke ranks and pursued the fleeing Normans down the slope. This was a fateful moment. Harold's discipline slipped for the first time as pockets of his soldiers left the defensive line. Duke William, however, was very much alive. In a famous act of battlefield leadership, William rode out in front of his troops, lifted the visor of his helmet, and shouted that he still lived, and that the Normans should rally. Medieval chroniclers note that William even had to remove his helmet to show his face clearly, urging his men to turn and fight. The sight of their commander alive restored Norman morale. William and his mounted knights then counterattacked the impetuous English who had come down the hill. These pursuers, separated from their own shield wall, were caught in the open. The Normans surrounded and slaughtered many of them, including, it seems, some notable figures. The Bayeux Tapestry depicts, at one point, the death of Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine during the battle's confusion. Some sources suggest they might have been killed in this phase, perhaps as they pursued, or during a melee just in front of the main line. Other accounts place their deaths later near Harold himself, but we cannot be sure. After this rally, the battle entered a lull around midday. Both sides paused, likely to regroup and catch their breath. The sun climbed toward its zenith and then began its early autumn descent. We can imagine the landscape, the gentle hillside with littered bodies, broken shields and weapons, the crisp air carrying the groans of wounded men. Perhaps there was a brief quiet as archers gathered arrows and knights changed mounts or got water. Harold's line, now somewhat depleted, closed ranks again on the ridge. They had held the first assault, but at a cost. The loss of those who chased and were cut off, including possibly some of Harold's family, was a blow. Still, the core of the shield wall remained intact. William was not finished. If anything, he learned from the chaotic retreat and success of the counterattack that the English shield wall could be cracked not by frontal assault alone, but by feigned retreat tactics. There is debate among historians, but most believe the Normans deliberately employed feigned flights in the subsequent attacks. Essentially, William likely instructed one flank, perhaps the Bretons, who had already almost done so unintentionally, to pretend to flee again, hoping to lure more impetuous English out of formation. According to later chroniclers like William of Poitiers and Orderic Vitalis, these feigned retreats were used possibly twice in the afternoon. Each time, groups of Normans would fall back as if broken, and when clusters of ferdmen gave chase downhill, the Norman cavalry would wheel around, isolate, and destroy those pursuers. This tactic gradually thinned out the English ranks. The disciplined housecarls likely stayed put with Harold on the ridge, but the less trained Ferd could not resist chasing what looked like a defeated foe. Harold, it is said, tried to signal and shout for his men to hold position, but amid the dust and noise, some did not heed the call. The tapestry even has an image interpreted as Harold, or one of his officers, yelling at the fleeing English not to pursue. Nonetheless, the damage was done. The once solid shield wall grew perforated, especially on the flanks, where many local levies had been stationed, and where pursuit was more tempting as the terrain was less steep. As afternoon wore on, William pressed the attack in earnest again. He may have ordered his archers to adopt a different tactic. Some 12th century sources claim that near the battle's latter phase, Norman archers shot high into the air so that arrows would fall straight down on the English behind their shields. This is not mentioned in the earliest accounts, and might be an embellishment, but it's plausible the Normans adjusted their archery to try to hit English further back ranks or over shields. If so, it could have caused more English casualties, or at least forced them to keep looking up as well as forward. We know from various sources that Duke William had several horses killed under him that day, demonstrating how he personally stayed in the thick of fighting. William of Poitiers says William had 2 or 3 mounts shot or cut from under him. Each time, William remounted and continued to lead, a testament to his resilience and to his knights who likely surrounded him to protect their lord whenever he was down. By late afternoon, the battle was reaching a climax. The English shield wall, though depleted, still held parts of the ridge, especially around where King Harold stood with his housecarls and the elite of his army. Duke William knew that as long as Harold lived and his standard flew, the English could reform again and again. Thus, the final Norman assault focused intensely on the centre where Harold was located. Knights on horseback, possibly including William himself, charged up. Archers shot arrows into that area. Infantry closed in. In these final moments, the English shield wall buckled and broke apart under relentless pressure. Housecarls fought hand to hand, refusing to yield even as their flanks were turned. It is here that King Harold met his end. The exact manner of Harold's death has become legendary. The Bayeux Tapestry famously shows an image of a figure with an arrow protruding from his eye, labelled Harold Rex, King Harold, is killed. Next to this figure is another being cut down by a Norman knight. It's ambiguous which figure is Harold, possibly the arrow in the eye, possibly the one being cut down, perhaps symbolically both. Contemporary accounts vary. One of the earliest written after the conquest, by a monk named Amatus of Monte Cassino in the 1080s, explicitly said, Harold died by an arrow to the eye. Norman sources like William of Jumièges don't detail it, but later English chronicler William of Malmesbury also says, an arrow struck Harold in the eye, and then a Norman knight slashed him down. Some Norman poets claim Duke William himself dealt the death blow, though that's likely propagandistic and considered unlikely. Another account from the Battle Abbey Chronicle years later simply admits no one knew exactly how Harold died, only that he fell in the fierce mix of battle. What we can say calmly is that late on 14th October, King Harold II was killed on the battlefield, near his flag, which reportedly showed a fighting man, and in the midst of his loyal guard. Alongside him died his brothers Gurth and Leofwine. If they had not fallen earlier, they certainly were dead by battle's end. Harold's housecarls, the king's household warriors, formed a ring around their fallen lord and fought to the last man rather than surrender. As one medieval writer put it, they died around their lord, like a shield wall unto death, which to the Normans was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. With Harold's demise, the English resistance began to collapse. Leaderless and exhausted, many of the remaining ferdmen lost heart and fled. Some groups continued to fight fiercely. Notably, there was a last stand at a place later called Malfosse, or Evil Ditch, slightly away from the main ridge. In that incident, some fleeing English turned on their pursuers from a hidden trench or gully and inflicted casualties on the Normans. One account says Count Eustace of Boulogne was badly wounded there, before being overcome. But aside from such small pockets, the battle was decided. By dusk, the Battle of Hastings was effectively over. It had lasted perhaps 9 hours, from morning to sunset. As the October sun set around 5 p.m., darkness and fatigue halted further large-scale killing. The Normans stood victorious on the bloody field. The Anglo-Saxon army was mostly destroyed or in flight. Throughout this narrative of the battle, we have refrained from dramatizing the gore or the valor in excited tones, but it should be understood that the day was one of horror and heroism combined. Thousands lay dead or dying. Some chronicles estimate that about 2,000 Normans were killed, and roughly double that number of English, 4,000, though precise figures are impossible to know. What is clear is that most of the English nobility was wiped out. Not only Harold and his brothers, but many thanes and nobles of southern England who had stood with their king. The Normans too lost a significant number of knights and vassals. William's victory had not come cheaply, but it was a victory. The last Anglo-Saxon king of England lay slain on the field, and Duke William of Normandy now had the pathway to the throne open before him. In the cool, dim evening after the battle, Duke William returned to the battleground with some of his magnates. They surveyed the grim harvest of corpses. Tradition says William ordered a search for Harold's body among the fallen. It was eventually identified, whether by certain marks on his body or by a lone survivor who recognized the king's remains. Some accounts say Harold's mistress, Edith Swanwick, was brought to identify him by markings only known to her. The body of the king was mutilated, according to some later stories, perhaps by vengeful Normans. But William forbade further desecration when he found out. The Norman duke had achieved the decisive battle he needed, yet much work remained to actually conquer England. We will cover that in the next sections: how William moved from victory at Hastings to securing the crown, what immediate aftermath followed on the battlefield, and what the conquest meant in the long run. For now, let us pause and reflect on what we have recounted. The Battle of Hastings was a turning point in English history. Our slow and detailed description has aimed to illuminate each stage without sensationalism. The shield wall stood, broke, reformed, and fell. Arrows flew, swords clashed, and a king died. All of this in the space of one daylight span on an October Saturday. In the calm that night, perhaps a gentle wind blew over the ridge and the groves nearby, with only the occasional moan of a wounded soldier to break the silence. The Normans made camp on the field, while any surviving English found their way through woods and darkness to safety where they could. The aftermath of Hastings was just beginning, a new chapter for England under Norman rule. Before moving on to the immediate aftermath and consequences of Hastings, it is useful to take a step back and calmly examine the tactics, equipment, and battle formations of the opposing armies. Understanding how the Anglo-Saxons and Normans fought helps clarify why the battle unfolded as it did. Anglo-Saxon tactics. The English army was almost entirely infantry-based. Their fundamental battlefield formation was the shield wall. This formation was essentially a defensive line of men standing shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their large shields to present a continuous barrier. Housecarls and thegns carried either kite-shaped shields, introduced by the Danes, or round shields, both effective for creating a wall. Behind the front rank's wall of shields, additional ranks provided depth and weight. The front line men would use spears and swords to stab at enemies who came close, or step forward to deliver axe blows, then step back into line. The key was unity. If everyone held together, it was difficult for an enemy to break through. At Hastings, this tactic initially gave the English an advantage in defence, especially positioned on a hill. The offensive capability of Harold's army lay primarily in the fearsome two-handed axes wielded by his housecarls. The Danish battle axe, a long hafted axe with a heavy blade, could cleave armour and sever limbs. A well-swung axe could even behead a horse. These axes required space to swing, so housecarls likely alternated with spearmen or positioned slightly behind the very front rank to step forward and strike. Many Norman knights learned the hard way how deadly these axes were when they got too close. Besides axes and spears, English warriors carried swords, though a good sword was a costly item, more common among the elite than the general fyrd. Some would have had seaxes, long knives, as sidearms. The typical defensive armour for a housecarl was a mail hauberk, a chainmail shirt reaching to mid-thigh, and a conical helmet with a nose guard. Fyrdmen might have simpler protection. Some had leather jerkins or padded gambesons, and perhaps old helmets from their forefathers, or none at all. As mentioned, Harold had few archers. Archery was not a major component of late Anglo-Saxon warfare, except perhaps in siege defence. A shortage of archers at Hastings meant Harold could not significantly harass the approaching Normans at range, forcing him to rely on the passive shield wall to absorb the enemy's approach. The English had no cavalry. In earlier times, Anglo-Saxon nobles rode to battle, but typically dismounted to fight on foot. At Hastings, some of Harold's high-born men likely arrived on horseback, but then fought in the shield wall. The ethos of Anglo-Saxon combat was defensive holding and hand-to-hand endurance. If the enemy did not break them, eventually the English could counterattack by advancing the shield wall forward, essentially pushing the enemy off the field. However, if the shield wall cohesion was lost, as happened via the feigned retreats, the effectiveness of the English force was severely compromised. Norman tactics. The Normans brought a more diverse military system with three arms cooperating: archers, cavalry, and infantry. William's battle plan, as best as we can interpret, was to use archers to disrupt and weaken the enemy, infantry to engage and fix the enemy line, and cavalry as the decisive force, to break through and exploit openings. This combined arms approach was relatively advanced for the time and had been honed in Norman warfare on the continent. The Norman cavalry was William's elite strike force. Norman knights were among the finest in Europe. They rode strong war horses trained for battle, capable of trampling enemies and not easily spooked. Knights carried lance, a spear used underarm to thrust in a charge, and a sword for melee. They also bore kite shields, long, pointed bottom shields ideal for mounted use, protecting the left side of the body and the leg, and wore mail hauberks and conical helmets similar to the English. A charging cavalryman could deliver tremendous kinetic impact, able to shatter infantry lines if those infantry lost formation or were not well protected by pikes or terrain. However, cavalry's great vulnerability was against a dense, unyielding wall of men with spears. Horses generally will not impale themselves on a hedge of spears, and if forced to, the horses might fall and throw their riders. The Anglo-Saxon shield wall at Hastings was, in essence, the exact sort of formation cavalry struggle against. That is why the Norman cavalry charges early on did not succeed. The wall held, and the slope further robbed the charges of speed. Norman archers provided the ranged component. Armed with self-bows, the longbow as we think of it came later, these were likely shorter bows with a decent draw weight, and some crossbows. The Bayeux tapestry possibly shows a figure with a crossbow indicating their presence. The archers could rain arrows on static foes. They had done this effectively in other battles on the continent. At Hastings, though, the upward angle and the stout English shields initially blunted their effectiveness. Eventually, as discussed, archers may have switched to lofted shots. One of those arrows, by many accounts, delivered the wound that struck Harold in the eye, a chance shot that proved momentous. The archers likely carried a quiver of arrows and perhaps a knife or small axe for personal defense, but they would not engage in melee unless pressed. Norman infantry were the foot soldiers drawn from Normandy and allied regions. They wore a mix of armor, many would have mail, others maybe just padded armor, and helmets. They carried spears, swords, and some possibly axes or clubs. Their role was to attack alongside the cavalry, keeping pressure on the shield wall. In effect, the infantry suffered the brunt of casualties in the early battle, as they engaged directly and were hacked at by the English axes. But their presence was crucial to support the knights. Cavalry alone would have been too risky to send repeatedly without infantry backup. A special note on formations. The Normans, as mentioned, were divided into 3 divisions, battles. Each probably advanced separately aligned with their portion of the enemy line. This allowed for a kind of staggered engagement, and also meant that one part, like the Bretons on the left, could retreat without the others necessarily retreating at the same time. This segmented approach might have actually facilitated the feigned flight tactic. One wing retreats, the others hold or advance, thus luring that section's opposite English wing out. The English, by contrast, seem to have formed in one continuous line on the ridge, possibly curved or angled back at the flanks to guard against being surrounded. They had fewer tactical subunits apparent to us. It was essentially one shield wall. Within it, perhaps the Royal Standard and best troops were centrally located, and more local levies on the flanks. Equipment quality. Both sides had good iron weapons and decent armour for those of rank. The Norman knights' equipment and the English housecarls were roughly equivalent. Both often had mail shirts, similar helmets, shields, swords. The main difference in equipment was the presence of Norman cavalry gear, saddles with high cantles for secure seating in a charge, stirrups which help in delivering blows. Actually, the Normans were among the early adopters of stirrups in Western Europe. Another difference was archery. Normans had specialized bows and possibly crossbows, whereas the English had very few, possibly just what some of the shire levies brought, like hunting bows or such. Use of terrain. The English chose the high ground at Senlac deliberately. Fighting downhill gave their missiles, stones, javelins, extra range, and hindered cavalry charges. The area in front of Harold's position may have also been somewhat constricted by woods and marsh, according to chronicles. If so, that further channeled the Norman attack. William, for his part, was constrained to approach from the south up that slope. Likely he didn't have a better option since Harold blocked the main road. William used the feigned retreat, a psychological tactic, to make up for disadvantages of attacking uphill. This tactic exploited the impulsiveness of less disciplined troops, a clever ploy that turned the terrain advantage somewhat back in William's favour, by drawing the English off their hill. In summary, the battle became a contest of steadfast defence versus combined arms offence. Harold's men sought to simply hold their line, knowing that time was on their side. As long as they held, William could not advance. William's men tried multiple methods, arrows, direct assault, trickery, to break that line. In a way, both strategies worked for a time. Harold's wall was practically impregnable in the morning. William's feints and adaptability paid dividends in the afternoon. When we think calmly about the equipment, the shield was perhaps the most important piece on the English side, forming a literal bulwark, and on the Norman side, the horse was the vital equipment, giving mobility and shock power. Once Harold lost his shields, when men left their posts or were killed, and William's horses found gaps, the equation shifted. It is interesting to note that some of the English fought to the very end even after being surrounded. They didn't rout immediately upon Harold's death. The housecarls in particular fought on in a close-ranked cluster. This speaks to their training and the deep-seated tradition of loyalty to one's lord in battle, a hallmark of the Anglo-Saxon warrior ethic. This review of tactics and equipment hopefully clarifies why Hastings ended as it did. If Harold's army had more archers or cavalry of its own, the story might be different. If William lacked archers or didn't employ cunning, he might have failed. It was the interplay of these elements that produced the outcome. We can imagine the field littered with evidence of these instruments of war. Broken arrow shafts, dented shields, swords snapped at the hilt, armour soaked in mud, and horses lying among men. The tapestry and chronicles mention that in the aftermath, the Normans collected up discarded weapons and armour, spoils of victory that also speak to the material culture of the armies. For example, many fine swords and mail shirts would have been taken from fallen English thanes. In the next section, we will move beyond the battle itself to describe the aftermath and Harold's fate, including how the Normans and English handled the immediate consequences on the battlefield and what happened in the days following the fight. When darkness fell on 14th October 1066, the once thunderous battlefield fell eerily quiet. The aftermath of the Battle of Hastings was both grim and consequential. Let us gently recount what happened in the hours and days after the battle, beginning with the fate of King Harold's body and the immediate actions of Duke William. On the morning after the battle, 15th October, Duke William returned to the battlefield to inspect the field of victory and to arrange matters. One of his first concerns was locating King Harold's body among the slain. Accounts differ on how Harold was identified. As mentioned earlier, some say it was Edith Swanwick, also called Edith the Fair, Harold's longtime companion, who knew his body by certain marks and was brought for the sad task. Others imply that Harold's brothers' bodies were found nearby, and by process of elimination, Harold was among the noble dead. In any case, Harold's corpse was recognised. William's treatment of Harold's remains is a subject of later legend. One story holds that Harold's elderly mother, Githa, offered William the weight of Harold's body in gold for the right to bury her son. William, perhaps still furious, or as a calculated display, supposedly refused this offer. Some Norman sources claim that William ordered Harold's body to be disposed of at sea, buried on the shore under a cairn of stones, since he had been guardian of the coast, as a kind of posthumous mockery. Whether this sea burial happened is doubtful. Other accounts suggest Harold was interred at a cliff or near the battlefield. Another tradition emerged later that Harold's body was secretly removed and buried at Waltham Abbey, an abbey Harold himself had founded some years earlier. Waltham Abbey long claimed to be Harold's resting place, although no definitive proof has surfaced. There are even legends, whispered in later centuries, that Harold did not die at Hastings at all, but survived as a hermit. These are almost certainly fanciful, born of the reluctance of a defeated people to accept the death of their king. For our purposes, we can calmly conclude that King Harold died in the battle, and that William saw him dead. William may have allowed an honourable burial eventually. Sources from the 12th century say Harold was indeed buried at Waltham Abbey, in the church he built, although those sources might reflect the abbey's own lore. On the battlefield itself, the Normans gathered their dead for burial. Many were interred in a mass grave, one that, intriguingly, has never been definitively found by archaeologists. The fallen English warriors were mostly left unburied at first, which was a harsh fate, but common after a lost battle. Some who had families or comrades who escaped might have been retrieved quietly in the night, but most corpses of the English nobility lay exposed. It is said that years later, bones from the battle still turned up on the hillside. The Normans eventually allowed some burials or removals. For instance, Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine possibly were taken by kin for burial, but many of the common ferdmen likely ended up in pits or simply left to decay. One account notes that the soil at Battle Hill was acidic, which would dissolve bones over time. For a long while it was assumed no trace would remain. However, in recent times, a skeleton found in a nearby area, originally thought to be from a different battle, has been re-evaluated and might be from a 1066 victim, hinting that not all physical evidence is lost. William had other concerns after the fight. He expected that with Harold dead and his army crushed, the remaining English lords would submit to him. He waited at Hastings for word of surrender. However, the English were not fully cowed yet. In London, the surviving nobles and clergy elected Edgar Atheling as the new king. Edgar was a young grandson of Edmund Ironside and great-nephew of Edward the Confessor, with a claim by blood, but no experience. Still, the Witenagemot, royal council, and prominent figures like Earls Edwin and Morcar, the same northern earls from Fulford who had survived that battle, supported Edgar as a rallying figure. Additionally, influential church leaders like Stigand, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Eldred, Archbishop of York, initially sided with Edgar. This meant William had to fight a bit more, or at least show force, to secure the throne. In early November 1066, William began moving his forces eastward toward London. He took a circuitous route, going via Kent to cut off any reinforcement or escape from the continent. At Southwark, just south of the Thames opposite London Bridge, William's men clashed with a local force and won, but he could not force his way over London Bridge. Rather than attack the stout London defences head-on, William marched west along the Thames Valley, burning some settlements as he went, to instill fear. He crossed the Thames at Wallingford in Berkshire, where Stigand came out and submitted to him. This was significant. Stigand was the highest church official. Though somewhat controversial as archbishop, he was recognised by the English, and his surrender hinted the winds were changing. William then moved toward London from the northwest, eventually reaching Berkhamsted, where the remaining English leaders, including Edgar Atheling, came out and submitted peacefully. The resistance in London fizzled without a decisive fight. Likely the Anglo-Saxons, shocked by Hastings and lacking Harold's leadership, felt capitulation was the only realistic course. With the submissions obtained, Duke William could claim the throne securely. On Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. It was a grand but tense ceremony. Norman soldiers stationed outside, supposedly misunderstanding shouts of acclamation from within, in the Old English tongue, as possible treachery or riot, set some nearby houses on fire out of alarm. The flames and noise upset many, and the rite concluded in chaos, with a fearful congregation, an odd omen at the coronation of a new regime. But William was now King William the Conqueror, often called William the Conqueror. Back at the battlefield site, William vowed to commemorate his victory in a spiritual way. It is said he made a vow, or perhaps was later instructed by the Pope's envoys, to build an abbey on the site of the battle. Indeed, a few years later, Battle Abbey was founded on the very hill where Harold's standard fell. The high altar of the abbey's church was reputedly placed at the exact spot where Harold was killed. Whether precisely accurate or not, this connection was emphasized. Monks were installed to pray for the souls of the dead of both sides. Over time, Battle Abbey's presence physically altered the topography. The ridge was partly leveled for construction, and a town named Battle grew up around it. The hillside, where so many had fought, eventually became a quiet monastic domain. And later still, after the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, the abbey's remnants turned into an estate with picturesque ruins. Today, as one walks those grounds, maintained by English heritage, one finds a sort of peace that belies the violence that occurred. The slopes are gentler now, and a plaque marks where Harold is said to have fallen. The immediate aftermath for the people of England was one of uncertainty and continued resistance. While Hastings broke the back of the Anglo-Saxon high nobility, pockets of rebellion flared in subsequent years, particularly in the north and east. In 1067, for instance, there was a rising in Exeter led by Harold's mother Geitha, which William put down. In 1068, Harold's surviving sons even tried a small invasion from Ireland but failed. The most serious revolts came in 1069, when the north of England, with Danish support, rebelled, prompting William's notorious harrying of the North campaign to crush resistance by devastating whole areas. By 1070, organised English resistance subsided, though guerrilla-style figures like Hereward the Wake in the Fenlands fought on briefly. Ultimately, Norman rule was cemented, and England's governance, culture, and land ownership were transformed, as we will discuss in the long-term consequences section. From a human perspective, the aftermath of Hastings was sorrowful. Many prominent English families lost husbands, fathers, and sons on that single day. It effectively decapitated the English aristocracy. William confiscated the lands of those who fought against him, which was nearly all the Anglo-Saxon nobility. In their place, he granted estates to his Norman followers, which began the sweeping elite replacement of Anglo-Saxon with Norman lords. We will explore that more soon. But consider that for common folk in Sussex and beyond, the landscape of power shifted violently. Castles began to be built everywhere by the new Norman lords to impose control. The very language of the ruling class changed from Old English to Norman French. Yet at the same time, life had to go on. Fields ploughed, churches attended, markets held. So in the near term, there must have been an odd mix of daily normalcy and uneasy change. One cultural artifact of the aftermath that deserves mention is the Bayeux Tapestry. Likely commissioned within a decade of the battle, traditionally thought to be by William's half-brother, Bishop Odo of Bayeux, this embroidery over 70 metres long depicts the events from Harold's visit to Normandy up to the end of Hastings. It served as a sort of visual recounting from the Norman perspective, perhaps intended to legitimize William's claim and celebrate the conquest. The tapestry is an invaluable piece of history, showing arms, armour, and scenes, like Harold's death by arrow, that have shaped popular imagination of the battle. In the tapestry's calm but vivid stitches, one sees the story we have told. A comet, a king's death, a battle with horses and falling soldiers, and a new king crowned. It is like a contemporary news report in thread and needle. One can picture someone in the 1070s standing before it, reading the Latin captions and reflecting on how much changed in such a short time. To conclude Harold's story on a gentle note, of all the figures in this drama, his is perhaps the most tragic. He was by accounts a capable and respected leader who on another day might have been hailed as a saviour king for repelling an invasion, as he did with Hardrada. Instead, by the chance of facing two invasions at once, he was overcome by the second. The English would later remember Harold with a mix of sorrow and slight mythologizing. Some folk tales claimed an archer named Toussaint fired the fateful arrow that hit Harold's eye. Names and stories to try to personalize that moment, which in truth remains a bit ambiguous. But for centuries after, English monks quietly prayed for the soul of King Harold II, even as Norman and then Angevin kings ruled over them. With the immediate aftermath covered, we will now widen our view. In the next section, we consider William's coronation and rule, essentially what he did after winning the crown, and how he went from conqueror to king. Then we will examine the broader long-term consequences of the Norman conquest on England, changes that unfolded gradually but profoundly in the years and generations after 1066. After the dust settled at Hastings and the remaining English leadership accepted William's authority, Duke William of Normandy advanced from victory in battle to the role of monarch. His coronation in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066 symbolized the official beginning of Norman rule in England. Let us calmly discuss William's coronation and the nature of his rule in the years immediately following the conquest. William's coronation ceremony was conducted by Eldred, the Archbishop of York, since Stigand of Canterbury was considered uncanonical by the papacy. The event, as briefly mentioned, was marred by an accidental panic. Norman guards outside mistook the shouts of acclamation from the inside for a riot, leading them to set fire to some buildings, which caused those inside to tremble with fear. Nonetheless, William was anointed and crowned King of England in the ancient tradition of English kings. In that moment, he legally became William Thant of England. It is notable that William swore an oath at his coronation to rule justly and uphold the existing laws of the land, a promise to respect the English, Anglo-Saxon laws, which he did in part to appease his new subjects. Despite the promise to maintain continuity, William's rule involved deep changes, especially among the aristocracy and church hierarchy. In the political landscape, William systematically replaced English nobles with Normans. In the first years, some English earls initially kept their titles if they submitted. For example, Edwin and Morcar were not immediately stripped of their earldoms in 1066-67. But as rebellions occurred, William lost trust in English lords, and by around 1070, almost all Anglo-Saxon earls had been removed. By 1075, every earldom was held by a Norman or other foreign ally. Major estates were confiscated and granted to Norman barons. This elite replacement was dramatic. Within 20 years, the Domesday Book, a great survey William ordered in 1086, showed that over 90% of land in England was in the hands of Norman lords or the king. The Old English nobility either perished, fled, or sank into obscurity as lesser gentry under Norman overlords. William rewarded those who fought for him with vast estates. For example, William's half-brother Odo was made Earl of Kent and given many lands. William Fitzosborne got large holdings in Wessex and on the Welsh border. These Norman lords were expected to secure their territories, which they often did by building castles, a new feature in the English landscape. Motte and Bailey castles sprang up in strategic locations, serving as garrisons to maintain Norman control. The presence of castles, often initially wooden towers on earth mounds with palisades, was novel to the English, who had fortifications but not in the dense, lordly pattern Normans introduced. Castles were centres of local dominance, from which a Norman castellan could project power over the surrounding countryside. On the religious front, William also Normanized the church. Many Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots were deposed, sometimes on the grounds of holding their position improperly, like Stigand, who was removed in 1070, or for alleged corruption. By a few decades into Norman rule, no English bishop remained. All sees were held by Normans or other continentals. For instance, Lanfranc, an Italian Norman scholar, became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070 and worked closely with William to reform and reorganize the English church. English abbots were replaced similarly, especially in larger monasteries. Norman clergy brought new styles of church architecture. Romanesque style. Think heavy stone, round arches, replacing wooden Anglo-Saxon churches with grand stone cathedrals. William did, however, maintain a stance of piety and cooperation with the church, partly as gratitude for papal support, and partly as genuine devotion. The separation of ecclesiastical courts for church matters from civil courts was emphasized under William, shaping the legal landscape. William's rule was marked by a combination of iron-fisted suppression and administrative continuity. He was unquestionably stern in quashing rebellions. The most infamous example, the harrying of the North in 1069-1070, saw William's forces devastate northern England, Yorkshire and beyond, to punish rebellion and deter Danish invaders who had allied with the Northerners. Contemporary chroniclers lament how villages were burned, crops destroyed, and people starved, an early instance of scorched earth policy. The result was that northern England was pacified, but at a terrible cost in lives and prosperity. Years later, Domesday Book still recorded many northern estates as waste, depopulated from that event. Administratively, William was actually quite savvy in using the existing English systems to his advantage. England's well-developed bureaucracy, as we noted, shires, sheriffs, courts, tax system, was largely kept intact. William relied on English administrative practices, like the geld tax for revenue. He issued writs in the same style as previous kings to instruct officials. Many of those officials, though, were Normans now. Sheriffs, shire reeves, who managed royal interests in each shire, soon were mostly Normans by the 1070s. So while the office continued, the office holders changed. William also continued using the royal treasury at Winchester and the mints to strike coin. Interestingly, his coins bear his name Pilhelm Rex, but are otherwise similar in quality to Edward the Confessor's, maintaining trust in the currency. One of William's notable administrative achievements was commissioning the Domesday Book in 1086, essentially a kingdom-wide survey of land and resources. This was unprecedented in scope, an exhaustive accounting of who held what, down to each manor, how many ploughs, villagers, animals, etc., and what it was worth. The Domesday Book was like a detailed inventory, enabling efficient taxation and confirming for William who held each piece of land, and thereby who owed him feudal service. It is a testament to both the continuity of record-keeping and the new Norman thoroughness in ruling England. To gather such data, William leveraged the existing shire courts and hundreds, summoning local juries to give sworn testimony on assets and tenures. This shows he used a mix of Norman and Anglo-Saxon methods. William's personal rule in England involved spending time both in England and in Normandy. He had to manage his continental holdings as well, which meant he was often crossing the Channel. In his absence, he appointed regents, often his half-brother Odo or his close companion William Fitzosborne in early years, to govern England. There were a few instances when he faced opposition, even from his inner circle. For instance, a revolt by Norman earls in 1075, known as the Revolt of the Earls, which William's regents put down. That reminds us that William had to balance rewarding his followers with keeping them in line. Some Normans grew almost as powerful as the king in their realms. Odo of Bayeux, for example, got so wealthy and ambitious that William later imprisoned him for a time when Odo was suspected of plotting an unauthorized venture in Italy. Culturally, during William's reign, there was initially a distinct divide between the Norman French-speaking aristocracy and the English-speaking commoners. William himself spoke Norman French, and likely some English, though it's said he relied on interpreters in formal settings early on. He did try to learn English customs to better rule. For example, he made a show of respecting the English saints and attending local ceremonies. But it was very clear that a new ruling class was in charge. Over William's 21-year reign, he ruled until 1087. A gradual fusion began, intermarriage between Normans and remaining English. Nobles, adoption of some English habits by Normans, and vice versa. However, some things William did were arguably moderate. He did not try to eliminate the English language or impose French on legal records. Latin remained the written administrative language for records, as it had been in late Anglo-Saxon times for many documents. He also retained many English laws, issuing what's known as the Laws of William, that basically reaffirmed King Edward's laws and added some Norman tweaks, like establishing that serious crimes would be dealt with by the king's justice, and trial by combat introduced for some cases. Everyday life for peasants might not have changed drastically immediately. They still tilled the same fields and owed rent or service to a lord, only now the lord was more likely to be named Robert or Hugh than Elfred or Godric. As king, William was formidable. His contemporaries described him as stern, sometimes wrathful, but also just in the sense of enforcing law and order strictly. Orderic Vitalis, an Anglo-Norman chronicler writing a generation later, gave a balanced view, praising William's good governance and even-handedness in some respects, but criticizing the brutality of some of his actions, like the harrying. William evidently retained a temper. One famous anecdote, in his later years, a dispute with King Philip of France, who mocked William's weight gain, led William to ravage the French border, during which campaign he suffered an injury leading to his death in 1087. Even the circumstances of his death and funeral have a bit of dark humour. His corpulent body supposedly burst due to internal injuries, an event recorded by chroniclers with a kind of grim fascination, but that aside. To bring focus back, William's early reign, from 1066 to, say, 1075, was the consolidating period. By 1075, rebellions were done, and nearly everything was Normanized. The latter part, 1075-1087, was more about governing a relatively pacified realm, strengthening castles, contending with occasional Viking threats, which came a few more times but never with success, and dealing with the Welsh and Scottish borders. William installed some of his followers on the frontiers, for example, on the Welsh border, the Marches. Normans like Hugh de Franches and Roger de Montgomery were given semi-autonomous authority to push into Wales. In Scotland, King Malcolm III had given refuge to English exiles, including Edgar Atheling. William made 2 campaigns into Scotland, 1072 being one, to assert overlordship, and Malcolm swore fealty temporarily. So William's rule also set the stage for how Norman England would interact with its Celtic neighbours. In summation, King William's coronation brought a change in dynasty, but he carefully styled himself as the legitimate successor of Edward the Confessor. He even had coinage minted that resembled Edward's, and he kept Edward's image on his royal seal initially to imply continuity. He took on Edward's epithet too, calling himself William, by the grace of God, King of the English. Over time, of course, it was clear that it was a Norman dynasty now, new blood on the throne and in all high places. But by using existing structures and emphasizing legality, for instance, he claimed that all lands in England were his by right of conquest and royal claim, and then he granted fiefs to his barons, in a way re-establishing a feudal contract from scratch. William laid a very solid foundation for stable rule. Indeed, despite the violence of conquest, once the rebellions were crushed, England under William and his immediate successors was generally stable and orderly compared to many other European kingdoms at the time. We will now proceed to consider the long-term consequences of William's conquest and rule on England as a whole, not just politically, but socially, linguistically, and culturally. In doing so, we will see how the events of 1066 echoed through centuries. The Norman conquest triggered profound long-term changes in England. In this section, we will explore these consequences in a calm, comprehensive manner, touching on the replacement of the elite, changes in governance, the fusion of cultures, linguistic shifts, and overall significance in the centuries to follow. Replacement of the aristocracy. One of the most immediate and lasting effects was the near-total elimination of the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. As mentioned earlier, William systematically dispossessed English landholders and redistributed their lands to Norman barons and knights. By 1086, according to Domesday Book, only about 5% of land in England was still held by English lords south of the Tees River. In many shires, not a single manor remained in English hands. This was a stark turnover. Anglo-Saxon nobles either died at Hastings or in subsequent rebellions, or were stripped of power and often had to marry into Norman families, or drop in status if they wanted to keep any property. The new Norman nobility brought feudal practices from France. They built castles, as we noted, which not only served military purposes, but also symbolized the new dominance. These castles, like the Tower of London begun by William, or the Motte at Windsor, or smaller keeps dotting the landscape, physically cemented Norman presence. They introduced the continental feudal system more formally. Though Anglo-Saxon England had elements of vassalage and lordship, Normans introduced a clearer hierarchy of king, tenant-in-chief, subtenants, peasants, with defined feudal obligations like knight service. One socio-political result of this was that England's leadership became oriented towards Normandy and France. The nobles often had estates on both sides of the Channel. For instance, a lord like Robert, Count of Mortain, William's half-brother, held lands in Normandy and large swaths of England. This brought England into the political orbit of continental Europe much more intimately than before. Anglo-Saxon England had been somewhat insular, though with strong links to Scandinavia. Now England was tied into French politics. In fact, over the next centuries, English kings, as Norman and later Angevin rulers, would spend a lot of time and resources involved in affairs across the Channel, changes in government systems, while, as earlier noted, the Normans kept many English institutions. There were important developments in governance. For one, the centralization of power under the monarchy increased. Anglo-Saxon kings were already powerful by 1066, but William arguably tightened the screws further. Through feudal homage, every landholder became directly or indirectly beholden to the king. One often cited point: at Salisbury in 1086, William had many landholders swear an oath of fealty to him directly. Even vassals of his tenants-in-chief swore, indicating that ultimately loyalty was to the crown. This concept of all land being held from the king became deeply ingrained. Norman rule also brought administrative innovations. While they retained shires and sheriffs, Normans introduced things like forest law. William declared large tracts as royal forest, where strict laws protected game animals and vegetation, limiting what locals could do there. This was a new legal framework that often oppressed common folk for the sake of aristocratic hunting pleasures. But it did establish a kind of early environmental regulation, albeit for royal benefit. William and his successors also promoted the writing of Latin charters and documents, continuing but expanding the written culture of royal administration. The Chancery writing office of the king became more active. Domesday Book itself stands as a monumental administrative feat that had no parallel in contemporary Europe. Language and culture. Perhaps the most famous long-term consequence of the Norman conquest was the transformation of the English language. The Normans spoke a form of Old French, Norman French, and this became the language of the ruling class. For about 300 years after 1066, French, in its Anglo-Norman dialect form, was the language of the royal court, the law courts, for a time, and high society in England. Meanwhile, Latin remained the language of written records, learning, and the church. English, Old English, was largely pushed out of official use. However, it persisted among the common people and even within the household of nobility, since many nobles married English wives or had English nurses for their children. Over time, the Old English tongue evolved as it mingled with French vocabulary and underwent grammatical simplification. By about the 13th and 14th centuries, this gave rise to Middle English, essentially a fusion of Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, and Anglo-Norman, French, linguistic elements. Thousands of French loanwords entered English, especially in areas of government, law, art, fashion, and food. For example, words like court, judge, castle, beauty, dinner, and battle replacing Old English words or adding alongside them, came from French influence. The famous differentiation between words for animals versus meats, cow beef, pig pork, sheep mutton, reflects Norman lords, who spoke French, eating what English peasants, who used English words for the animals, raised. English today is a direct beneficiary of this melding, a dual-layer vocabulary, where often a simpler word is Germanic, like house, and a more formal synonym is French, Latin, mansion. However, it's important to note that English did not disappear. By 1200, children of Norman descent were speaking English as well as French, and by 1400, English reasserted itself as the primary language even of the elite, with a lot of French seasoning in it. The first English king whose mother tongue was English after 1066 was probably Henry IV, crowned 1399. So the conquest's linguistic impact took time to unfold, but was massive in shaping modern English. Culturally, the Normans brought new styles in architecture. They built impressive Romanesque churches and cathedrals. Many English cathedrals, Canterbury, Durham, Winchester, etc., were either begun anew or significantly remodeled in the Norman period. They introduced Romanesque art forms, motifs, and a continental monastic revival, for instance, a wave of Cluniac monasteries coming in. They also brought chivalric culture. The idea of knighthood, chivalry, and romance literature eventually seeped into England, though more in the 12th century and beyond. Tournaments and the code of knightly conduct had not been an Anglo-Saxon feature. Normans imported those martial traditions. Another consequence was in the legal system. While Anglo-Saxon law provided a base, and many laws of property and inheritance continued, the Normans introduced the concept of trial by combat, as an alternative to trial by ordeal or jury in certain cases. Over the next century, the unique English common law would develop, blending Anglo-Saxon customary law with Norman feudal law. The jury system, which existed in embryo in Anglo-Saxon times, for example juries of presentment in shires, was further developed under Norman kings, notably Henry II slightly later, who formalized juries for civil and criminal cases. Arguably, without the initial need for Normans to administer a foreign land systematically, such legal innovations might not have accelerated as they did. Social structure. The conquest cemented the feudal stratification of society. Under the Normans, the manorial system, lords and vassals, and serfs bound to the land, may have tightened. While many peasants had been semi-free ceorls under Anglo-Saxons, more of them may have fallen into outright serfdom, unfree status, under Norman lords who imposed harsher obligations. Certainly, the records of Domesday classify a large portion of rural folk as villeins and bordars, categories of unfree peasants. Of course, Anglo-Saxon England had slavery, thralls, to a degree, which Normans gradually eliminated. The church discouraged slave trading, and it seems by about 1100 slavery as such was gone, though serfdom is similar in effect. Women's roles in the aristocracy also changed slightly. Anglo-Saxon noblewomen had been able to own property and wield influence, e.g., they could be powerful abbesses or landholders. Under Norman law, noblewomen's rights in property were somewhat curtailed in favour of their husbands, though queens like Matilda, William's wife, and later Empress Matilda did exercise power. It was more exceptional. In Broadview, the conquest oriented England away from the Scandinavian world and more towards the Franco-European world. Prior to 1066, one might have expected England to continue having kings of Danish or Norwegian connection. After all, King Cnut had ruled earlier, and Hardrada attempted to. After 1066, England's kings spoke French and saw themselves as part of the French-derived high culture. The Viking-era influence waned. Even though many Danes remained in England's population, their elite was replaced. Over time, this helped integrate England into the medieval European milieu, eventually partaking in things like the Crusades. Robert Curthose, William's son, went on First Crusade. Later kings like Richard the Lionheart took major roles in crusades. Arguably, England's role in European geopolitics grew due to Norman ties. For instance, the long Angevin Empire and the Hundred Years' War down the line have roots in the events of 1066, since the kings of England ended up holding vast French territories, leading to centuries of Anglo-French conflict. A subtler long-term effect was on the English identity. Pre-conquest, English meant Anglo-Saxon essentially, with inclusion of Danes in Danelaw. After the conquest, there was a sense of English, mostly commoners, versus Normans, rulers. Over generations, these distinctions blurred and a new combined identity emerged. But English chroniclers, like those who wrote the Peterborough Chronicle in the decades after 1066, wrote with a palpable sense of loss and subjugation. Eventually, however, the descendants of Normans started to see themselves as English. By the 13th century, we see surnames of Norman origin thoroughly embedded in England's populace, and the ruling class identifying with England, especially after they lost most of their continental lands under King John in 1204, which forced them to root themselves in England. There were also legal and administrative consequences that lasted. For example, the Exchequer, royal treasury system, established under Henry the Fern, was a direct evolution of Norman financial administration tracking revenue, something the strong fiscal mindset of Normans like William, who wanted to maximize income from his new kingdom, set in motion. The persistent idea that all land is held from the crown, the feudal land tenure principle, lasted in English law in some form up until modern times. Technically, even today in UK law, land ownership is often said to be ultimately derived from the sovereign, a vestige of feudal tenure theory. Another consequence, the conquest altered the course of English literature. Old English literary tradition, like Beowulf, Anglo-Saxon poetry, largely died out as an active form. Latin and French literature became the modes for written works. Only by the 14th century did a robust English literature reappear, Chaucer, etc., and that English was heavily Romance-influenced in style and vocabulary because of the intervening French effect. So there's a gap where we have fewer works in English. We have some, like the continuation of the Chronicle into the 1100s, but the style becomes simpler as Old English transitions to early Middle English. Meanwhile, literature in England in the 12th century was mostly in Latin or French, e.g. Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain was in Latin, Wace's Roman de Brute in French, etc., shaping the legendarium, like Arthurian legends, which took off in Anglo-Norman court circles. It's also interesting to consider the genetic and demographic aspect. Normans themselves were not huge in number. Perhaps at most 10,000, 20,000 Normans settled. Knights, soldiers, then families. They intermarried with locals, so the gene pool didn't drastically shift. It was more a cultural superimposition. But their presence in certain strata, like more in southern and eastern England near power centres, might have had local demographic imprint. Over time, though, distinctions blurred. In summary, the Norman conquest's long-term consequences for England include a new ruling elite and feudal system entrenchment, closer ties to continental Europe, particularly France, altering foreign policy and cultural orientation, the development of Middle English from the mix of Old English and Old French, fundamentally transforming the English language, architectural and artistic transformations via Romanesque and later Gothic styles, introduced by Normans, the Tower of London, stone cathedrals like Durham, etc., still stand as testaments to Norman influence. Administrative continuity with enhancements like Domesday Book and the Exchequer, setting groundwork for a uniquely well-documented and centralised medieval state. The eventual emergence of a new Anglo-Norman identity that evolved into the English nation as we know it, combining Norman and Anglo-Saxon heritages. It is often said that 1066 is the last time England was successfully conquered by a foreign force. It indeed marked an end of one epoch and the start of another. The Anglo-Saxon period gave way to the Anglo-Norman medieval era. Many aspects of English life, from law to language to aristocratic lineage, carry the imprint of that conquest even now. For example, many common English surnames or place names derive from Norman origin. The fact that our words for fine dining, mutton, beef, pork, are French, while the living animals, sheep, cow, pig, have English names, is a living linguistic museum of the social hierarchy set in 1066. To bring a quiet close to this section, by the time William the Conqueror died in 1087, England was irrevocably set on a new trajectory. Over the next centuries, it would develop into a feudal kingdom more akin to its continental neighbours, eventually developing things like Parliament, which ironically grew out of the King's Great Council, itself partly an import of Norman feudal council practice. The fusion of Normans and English created a dynamic culture that produced everything from the English common law system to Gothic cathedrals and universities in later medieval times. While one cannot attribute all those to 1066 alone, it's fair to say the conquest was the catalyst for a reorientation that allowed those later developments. The Anglo-Saxon chapter closed, and a new Anglo-Norman chapter opened, out of which the England of the High Middle Ages emerged. Having looked at these broad consequences, we can now touch on the myths, legends, and cultural legacy surrounding the Battle of Hastings itself, and the Norman Conquest as our next focus. This will include how people later mythologized Harold's death, how the conquest was remembered or romanticized, and how it lives on in cultural memory, for instance through commemorations, literature, and of course the Bayeux Tapestry already discussed. The Battle of Hastings and its protagonists soon passed into legend and lore. In this section, we will calmly examine some of the myths and cultural legacy that have grown around the events of 1066, and how the Norman conquest has been memorialized or interpreted through the ages. One of the most enduring images is King Harold with an arrow in his eye. We have discussed how this depiction comes from the Bayeux Tapestry and certain chronicles. Over time, this detail took on almost legendary certainty in popular imagination. Ask many people, and they will say, Harold was shot in the eye. This likely originated as Norman propaganda or moral allegory, the notion that perjury, if Harold indeed broke an oath to William, was punished by God with an arrow to the eye being a symbol of forswearing. By the 12th century, chroniclers like William of Malmesbury and Wace repeated the arrow in eye story, cementing it. It became a sort of mythic detail, even though, as we noted, the tapestry is ambiguous, and Harold may also have been cut down by knights. The arrow story is an example of how history and myth intermingle. It may be true or partly true, but it became emblematic of the battle, a kind of shorthand in lore for Harold's demise. In Victorian times, artists painted the scene of Harold tugging an arrow from his eye amid battle, and that became a common tableau in history books. Another legend surrounds Harold's fate. The most romantic of these holds that Harold did not actually die at Hastings. There was a story that surfaced later that an old hermit found years afterward in Chester was actually Harold, living out his days in penitent anonymity after escaping the battlefield. This has no evidence and is almost certainly fictional, a type of folklore that often arises for lost heroes, similar to King Arthur's once and future king myth. But it shows that Harold became a kind of tragic hero in the English mind. There was a reluctance to accept that he was truly gone. Waltham Abbey's claim that Harold's body was buried there in secret, not known to the Normans, also has a bit of romantic defiance to it, as if part of Harold remained unconquered in the soil of his own foundation. The Normans, for their part, had their own heroic narrative. William the Conqueror was celebrated in Norman oral tradition and later chronicles as God's agent who rightfully took England. They propagated the tale of Harold's broken oath, depicted in the tapestry where Harold is shown swearing on holy relics to support William's claim. That scene in the tapestry, with the Latin Harold sacramentum fecit, Wilhelmo Duci, Harold swears an oath to Duke William, is essentially legend-making. It's not independently verified in English sources, and likely it was Norman propaganda, but it became an accepted part of the story. Medieval Norman writers like Orderic Vitalis spun the conquest as a morally justified action, ordained by God, underscored by Halley's comet as a divine sign which they loved to point out. These elements, a comet, a betrayed oath, an arrow in the eye, give the Hastings story a dramatic, almost fated quality, which later retellings amplified. Over the centuries, the cultural legacy of 1066 took on different tones. By the high medieval era, Normans and English had merged, so the conquest was sometimes seen as a necessary, if violent, step in England's advancement. Chroniclers of later medieval England, writing in Latin or Anglo-Norman French, often took pride in the Norman heritage. Some described Hastings as a manifestation of God's will to renew or discipline England. In the early modern period, after the Middle Ages, antiquarians started to look back at Anglo-Saxon times with more sympathy, especially Protestant scholars under the Tudor and Stuart eras who saw the pre-conquest English church as purer. They sometimes cast William in a more negative light, as a harsh conqueror. By the 18th and 19th centuries, when nascent English nationalism grew, Harold was somewhat rehabilitated as an English hero who unfortunately lost. Victorian historians like Edward Freeman wrote extensively about 1066, praising Harold's nobility and lamenting the Norman yoke that followed, a term used to describe the oppression of the Anglo-Saxons by the Normans. So a bit of a mythos of the good Saxon versus bad Norman took hold in some Victorian imagination. This was also when the romanticization of the Anglo-Saxons happened, seeing them as free and democratic, the folk moots, etc., contrasted with autocratic Normans. These broad strokes were part myth, part selective reading of history. In literature and popular culture, 1066 has appeared many times. For example, Shakespeare's play Macbeth indirectly references the Norman conquest. At the end, the victorious Malcolm, an analogue for the later Malcolm who interacted with Normans, brings in the concept of an English king bringing order, etc., though that's before 1066. More directly, there have been historical novels and poems. Tennyson, the Victorian poet, wrote a verse drama called Harold, sympathizing with Harold's plight. Modern novelists like Helen Hollick or Cecilia Holland have written fiction about 1066, sometimes portraying Harold heroically. On the popular memory front, the Bayeux Tapestry itself is a key piece of cultural legacy. Miraculously preserved, with some damage but mostly intact, and now displayed in Bayeux, France, it draws many visitors, a medieval comic strip retelling the conquest. It has inspired countless reproductions and even parodies. In 2000, for the millennium of the event, there was a project to create a modern Bayeux tapestry panel to add to it, illustrating the 20th century. This was more of an educational art project. Anniversaries of Hastings have been observed. In 1966, 900 years, and 2016, 950 years. There were large-scale reenactments at Battle Abbey Field, with thousands of reenactors from around the world coming to refight the battle in costume. These events, covered in media, show how the battle still captivates people as a turning point in English history. The town of Battle in East Sussex, which grew around the abbey on the site, keeps the memory in its very name. There's a local high school named Battle Abbey School. The high altar stone marking Harold's spot is still shown to visitors, almost like a pilgrimage site for history enthusiasts. There are many place names in England reflecting Norman influence, but interestingly, one rarely sees overt references to Hastings in, say, city names. However, in the English language, idioms like arrow in the eye aren't common, but the date 1066 is one of the best known in English history, often the only date people remember from school history lessons because of its iconic status. 1066 and All That, a famous satirical history book by Seller and Yeatman, capitalized on that recognition, the title itself a tongue-in-cheek nod. Another cultural legacy is in heraldry and symbols. The coat of arms of the UK, the lions, is derived from Norman heraldic symbols. Norman kings used lions. The very concept of heraldry was introduced by Normans. Many noble families in Britain today trace lineage to Norman knights, often celebrated by Victorian genealogists, possibly embellished. Surnames of Norman origin, those starting with Fitz, or names like Montgomery, Beaumont, Percy, etc., became part of the British aristocracy's fabric. In a gentler, perhaps more humorous vein, one could mention how the conflict of Saxons versus Normans inspired later fictional stories like Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe, which, set in the 12th century, portrays tensions between Saxon-descended nobles and Norman lords, even though by then they were mostly integrated. That novel gave us enduring characters and tropes, like the Saxon underdog, the noble outlaw Robin Hood, who, in some versions, fights Normans. In modern times, the Norman conquest still fascinates. There are numerous documentaries. The battle site is an educational destination. The phrase Norman yoke occasionally appears in political discourse historically. Radicals in the 17th century invoked it to decry aristocratic oppression, implying it started with the Normans. One might consider mythic the view that everything suddenly changed on that single day. Historians now acknowledge that many aspects of everyday life persisted for common folk. Fields were still ploughed in the same way. Village life continued. But in nationalist narratives, Hastings is often dramatized as the end of Anglo-Saxon England and a cataclysmic change. This oversimplification is itself part of the battle's legend, a clean break in history, taught as such. To conclude this section on a calming note, one could reflect that today, Normandy and England are at peace, and the events of 1066 are distant yet still resonant. The Bayeux Tapestry stands as a collaborative treasure of two nations. In 2025, plans have even been discussed for it to be exhibited in Britain, a gesture of shared heritage. Each time people dress up in mail and helmets on the battlefield to reenact, they are participating in keeping the memory, if not the exact reality, of 1066 alive in a communal and educational way. The cultural legacy of Hastings thus ranges from scholarly history and language to folklore and popular reenactment. The battle's story, whether Harold's arrow or William's daring, continues to be told, examined, and reinterpreted. As one walks the quiet grounds at Battle today, with birds chirping and the ruins of the abbey nearby, it's hard to imagine the fury of that long-ago fight. Yet the legacy is all around us, in words we speak, castles we visit, and the very notion of what it means to be English, shaped in part by that fusion of Saxon and Norman, which began on October 14th, 1066. Let us now gently summarize the journey we have taken through the history of the Battle of Hastings and its context, to reinforce the key points in a soothing, conclusive manner. We began in the early 11th century, observing an England that was stable under Anglo-Saxon rule, yet facing a succession crisis after the death of King Edward the Confessor in January 1066. Edward's passing opened the door to multiple claimants: Harold Godwinson, the powerful English earl chosen by the Witenagemot; William, Duke of Normandy, who asserted a promise to the throne; and Harold Hardrada of Norway, who invaded to press a dynastic claim. We saw how Harold Godwinson swiftly took the crown and then swiftly had to defend it, first rushing north to defeat Hardrada at Stamford Bridge in September, and then racing south to confront the landing of William of Normandy in Sussex. We then described in calm detail the fateful Battle of Hastings on 14th October 1066. Throughout that day, Harold's brave infantry formed a steadfast shield wall on Senlac Hill. Duke William's Norman French forces, with archers, foot soldiers, and knights on horseback, made repeated attacks. In the morning, the English held strong, their shields deflecting arrows and their axes felling many foes. The battle hung in the balance until William employed clever tactics, the feigned retreats that drew portions of Harold's army out of formation. Bit by bit, this weakened the once impenetrable English line. As the sun sank lower, the final Norman assault broke through. King Harold, who had stood with valor at the center of his line all day, was killed in the closing phase of the battle. His two brothers perished as well, And with the king's fall, the English resistance crumbled. The Normans emerged victorious, though at heavy cost. Duke William had achieved what he came for. The road to the English crown lay open to him. In the aftermath, we saw the stark consequences. William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066 in Westminster Abbey, becoming known to history as William the Conqueror. He moved swiftly to secure his new realm, dealing with pockets of resistance over the next few years until all major opposition was crushed. The Norman Conquest brought about profound changes. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was virtually replaced by Norman lords. A new French-speaking aristocracy ruled over the English-speaking populace, altering the culture and language of the country. Old English gradually mingled with Norman French, evolving into Middle English, a language enriched with French vocabulary and simpler grammar, which would, centuries later, become the English we speak today. Yet, as we noted, William maintained much of England's existing governance frameworks, the shires, sheriffs, courts, and tax system, using them to his advantage. Over time, Anglo-Norman England found stability. The kingdom became more centralized under strong Norman kings. The Great Survey of Domesday Book in 1086 exemplified the administrative thoroughness that the Normans added to English governance. Feudalism took firmer root. Castles dotted the landscape, some of whose ruins still stand peacefully today, reminding us of that era of fortification and control. Through the centuries, the events of 1066 were remembered and retold. Legends grew. The poignant tale of Harold's arrow in the eye, the lore of his secret burial, the poetic signs in the sky like Halley's comet. The Bayeux Tapestry, woven shortly after the conquest, has preserved the story in wool and linen for nearly a millennium. We can still gaze upon it and see the drama unfold in its panels. King Edward's death, Harold's coronation, the comet, the battle, and Harold's fall, all rendered in mute images that speak volumes. It is a silent chronicle of that turbulent time, yet in the stillness of its depiction, we find a narrative that has captivated generations. Today, we look back at the Battle of Hastings with a mix of awe and reflection. It is recognized as one of the great turning points of English history, often cited in textbooks as the end of Anglo-Saxon England and the beginning of Norman England. And indeed, its impact was enormous. But from our calm vantage, we can also see continuity amidst change. The ordinary people of England continued their lives, gradually absorbing the new influences. In time, Normans and English became one people. The Kingdom of England emerged from the medieval centuries, a blend of the two, stronger in some ways for the fusion. Standing on the field of Hastings, at the site now aptly named Battle, one might feel a serene breeze and hear birdsong in the trees. The field that once rang with the clash of sword on shield is now green and gentle. A visitor can walk along the ridge where Harold's warriors stood, or descend the slope where Norman knights charged. It is peaceful now. One can almost not imagine the frenzy of that day long ago. Such is the passage of time. Events that were once so earth-shaking eventually settle into the landscape and memory, becoming part of history's tapestry. In our narration, we have traced the steps from historical background, understanding why 1066 came to be such a pivotal year, through the battles and marches, and onward to the aftermath and legacy. We have done so slowly and carefully, letting the significance emerge without sensationalism. The story of the Battle of Hastings is dramatic in itself, yet in telling it with a gentle voice, we find that it can also be a story of resilience and adaptation. Despite conquest and upheaval, life continued, new synthesis arose, and England went on. In final thought, the Battle of Hastings reminds us how fortunes can change in a single day. The morning of 14th October 1066 saw an English king on his throne and a duke on foreign shores. By nightfall, the king was gone, and the duke was poised to be king. It underscores the fragility of human endeavors, how fate and perhaps a few crucial decisions can sway the course of history. And yet, while leaders and laws changed, the land and its people endured, and eventually flourished again under a new order. We can now let this story gently settle in our minds. The image of King Harold bravely defending his realm and Duke William steadfastly pushing for victory slowly fades as we step back from the details. What remains is a deep appreciation for the tapestry of history, how threads of different colours, the gold of Normandy, the blue of Anglo-Saxon England, were woven together to create the fabric of a nation. The Battle of Hastings was a moment of weaving, albeit wrought in conflict. As we conclude, we do so with a sense of tranquility. The battles are over. Only lessons and legacy remain. It is often said that history is written by the victors, in this case, the Normans. But over time, history belongs to everyone as a shared memory. The Normans and Saxons are long gone, but their descendants together became the English. And so, out of conquest, eventually came unity. Today's England, and indeed the English-speaking world, still carries echoes of 1066 in language and law, even if faintly. In our quiet retelling, we have paid homage to those distant events and the people of that time. Now, with the story fully told, we can let it rest, like the calm that followed the battle, bringing this journey through history to a gentle close.